The crowd's laughter hit Mara Whitmore like a fist to the chest. She had heard cruel words before, plenty of them, but nothing quite like the sound of 200 people laughing at the same moment, all of them looking directly at her. Men in suspenders slapping their knees, women hiding smirks behind gloved hands, children pointing without shame because no one had taught them better. And at the center of it all stood Victor Blackwell. He hadn't laughed. That was the thing about Victor. He never laughed. He smiled, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that knew exactly how much damage it was doing. He stood near the auction platform in his pressed linen coat, thumbs hooked into his vest pockets, watching Mara the way a man watches something he's already decided has no value. "Well," Victor said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, "at least now we know what free looks like." The laughter doubled. Mara did not move. She kept her eyes forward and her hands still at her sides, and she breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe through the worst moments. Slow, deep, deliberate. Like she was filling herself with something the room couldn't take from her. She had no idea that the man standing 20 feet away, a rancher with cracked boots and tired eyes and nothing left to lose, was about to change everything. If you've ever been underestimated by people who didn't bother to look twice, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next is the kind of thing most people never see coming. And if you're watching right now, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The marriage auction in Red Hollow had started, like most things in that town, as someone else's idea of a solution. The summer of 1887 had been the third dry summer in a row, and the land around Red Hollow had gone the color of old bone. Wells that families had relied on for 20 years were pulling up nothing but mud, and then nothing at all. Cattle were being sold off cheap or dying in the fields, and the men who had built their lives on the promise of that land were starting to look at each other with the particular hollow expression of people who have run out of options. Someone, nobody could agree later on who had first suggested it, proposed the auction as a practical arrangement. Struggling ranchers who needed capable wives. Women from the eastern cities and the crowded towns who wanted a fresh start. A transaction dressed up as opportunity. The town council had approved it inside of a week, and now here they were on a Saturday morning in the dry heat, gathered in the open square beside the feed store, watching a line of women stand on a raised wooden platform while the auctioneer read their names and the crowd decided what they were worth. Colter Hayes stood at the back of the crowd and tried not to think about how much he hated being here. He was 34 years old, and he looked 10 years older than that, not because life had been particularly cruel to him, but because he had never been the kind of man who thought to take care of himself. His face was weathered in the way that faces get when a person spends most of their waking hours outside, and there were lines around his eyes that had been there since his late 20s. His coat was clean, but the elbows were wearing through, and he'd put on his better boots even though one of them had a sole that was starting to separate at the toe and made a faint slapping sound when he walked. He hadn't wanted to come. His neighbor, a red-faced man named Denton, who raised hogs and had opinions about everything, had told Colter straight that a wife was the one thing that might save the Fallen Creek Ranch, and that Colter was a fool if he didn't at least show up and look. "You need someone who can work," Denton had said. "Someone practical. You're not looking for romance, Hayes. You're looking for a partner." Colter hadn't argued because arguing with Denton took more energy than he had, and also because Denton wasn't entirely wrong. The ranch was failing. He had known it for 2 years, and he had spent those 2 years trying every solution he could think of and watching each one dissolve like salt in water. He had cut expenses until there was almost nothing left to cut. He had sold off the East Pasture cattle to cover the debt on the equipment. He had renegotiated twice with the bank in Graysville, and the man there, a thin-lipped fellow named Craddock, who smelled like pipe tobacco and condescension, had made it very clear that there would not be a third negotiation. The ranch had belonged to Colter's father, and to his father before that. The idea of losing it didn't feel like a financial problem. It felt like a kind of death. So he had put on his better boots and come to the auction and stood at the back of the crowd. And now he was watching men he had known his whole life bid on women they had never met. And the whole thing felt wrong in a way he couldn't properly name. The women on the platform varied. Some of them were young and clearly terrified, clutching small bags or keeping their eyes fixed on some point above the crowd. Others were older, with the composed expressions of people who have made peace with difficult circumstances. A few seemed almost businesslike about the whole arrangement, scanning the crowd with the frank assessment of someone trying to determine the quality of what they were getting into. Most of them were spoken for quickly. The bidding was brisk for the younger women, and some of the older men in the crowd made offers that Colter found quietly disgusting. The way they called out numbers, the way they would call out bids on livestock without looking at the women's faces at all. He was starting to think about leaving when Victor Blackwell arrived. Victor didn't arrive quietly. He never did. He came through the edge of the crowd and people moved for him, not because they were pushed, but because they had learned over the years that it was easier to move for Victor than to stand in his way. He was 50 years old and still had the build of a younger man, broad through the shoulders, with silver at his temples, and the kind of groomed appearance that communicated, at a glance, that he had money and intended for you to know it. Victor Blackwell owned the largest landholding in the county. He owned 3 of the businesses on the main street of Red Hollow, including the bank, not the one in Graysville where Colter did his dealings, but the smaller local one that handled the accounts of most of the ranchers and farmers in the area. He sat on the town council. I was involved, in one way or another, in almost every significant transaction that happened in Red Hollow, and he had a gift for being involved in a way that always seemed to benefit himself more than anyone else, but subtly enough that most people couldn't say exactly how. Colter didn't like Victor Blackwell. He had made his peace with that fact years ago and didn't waste much energy on it. Victor took up a position near the front of the crowd, nodded at the auctioneer, and the proceedings continued. The second-to-last woman on the platform was someone named Clara, who was 18 and had come from a place in Ohio. She was nervous and pretty, and the bidding for her was fierce and brief, and Colter watched the whole thing with a feeling of tired resignation. Then there was a pause, and the auctioneer, a man named Pruitt, who had the voice of someone who could project across a field, but the manner of someone who was always slightly embarrassed by himself, cleared his throat. "Last up," Pruitt said, and his voice had a quality that Colter couldn't quite identify at first, something carefully neutral. Mara Whitmore, age 31, originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Mara Whitmore stepped forward. She was not what the crowd had been expecting. Colter could feel the shift in the air before anyone said anything. A subtle realignment, people straightening up or glancing at each other, a few suppressed sounds. She was a large woman, full-figured in a way that the town's standards of the time did not consider fashionable, and she walked with a steadiness that didn't apologize for itself. Her dress was plain but good quality, dark green wool, and her dark hair was pinned simply. She was not beautiful in the way the crowd considered beauty. She was something else that most of them didn't have a word for. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Victor Blackwell said, clearly and without hurry, "Well, at least now we know what free looks like." The laughter that followed was the kind of laughter that feels like a physical thing. It rolled through the crowd, and Colter watched it happen. Watched men he'd known for years double over. Watched women cover their mouths with their hands while their shoulders shook. He watched Pruitt the auctioneer stare at his papers with the expression of a man who wants to be somewhere else. He watched Victor Blackwell smile his particular slow smile. And he watched Mara Whitmore stand on that platform and not move. That was the thing that caught him. Not her size, not her face, not the dress or the posture or any of the things the crowd was reacting to. It was the stillness. She stood there while 200 people laughed at her, and she didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't do any of the things that people do when they're humiliated. She just stood, and her eyes moved through the crowd with a calm, quiet attention, like she was studying something. Her eyes reached Colter. He didn't know why he didn't look away. He usually would have. He was not a man who went looking for trouble or confrontation or complicated situations, and meeting the eyes of a woman on an auction platform while a crowd laughed at her was all 3 of those things. But he didn't look away, and she didn't either, and there was a moment, probably only 2 or 3 seconds, the kind of moment that feels longer from the inside, where something passed between them that he couldn't have described if someone had paid him to. Pruitt cleared his throat again, more uncomfortably this time. So, anyone, bidding is open at no bids, called someone from the left side of the crowd, and there was more laughter. "She can have my mule," someone else called. Pruitt's ears were red. "Gentlemen, please, I'll take her." The words were out of Colter's mouth before he had fully decided to say them. He heard them the way you sometimes hear yourself speak in a dream, slightly delayed, slightly surprised. The crowd went quiet faster than it had laughed, which was interesting. Silence spread from where he was standing outward, like rings on water. Colter walked forward. His boot made its small slapping sound with each step, and he was aware of it in a way he hadn't been a moment ago, aware of every particular detail. The dust on his coat, the worn state of his cuffs, the way people were staring at him with expressions ranging from astonishment to contempt. He stopped in front of the platform and looked up at Mara Whitmore. "I'll take her," he said again, quieter this time, directing it at Pruitt. "Whatever the arrangement is." Mara looked down at him. Her expression had not changed, but something in it shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like she was updating a calculation. Victor Blackwell's voice cut across the square. "Hayes." He said it the way some men say a name, not as an address, but as a summary of their opinion. "You sure you want to add another liability to a ranch that's already going under?" The crowd tittered. Colter didn't look at Victor. "I'm sure," he said. Pruitt, looking intensely relieved that something was happening, shuffled his papers. "Right. Well, Colter Hayes, bid stands, and—" "Doesn't he mean free?" Victor said, and the laughter came back. Easier now, more relaxed, the crowd enjoying itself again. Colter turned then. He looked at Victor directly, which was something most men in Red Hollow had learned not to do without reason. Victor met his gaze with the patient, amused look of a man who has never had a reason to be nervous. "The lady's name," Colter said, "is Mara Whitmore." It was not a threat. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was just a sentence stated plainly, and yet the crowd shifted again in that particular way, and Victor's smile thinned by a fraction, just a fraction, before it reassembled itself. Colter turned back to Pruitt. "Where do I sign?" "One." The signing was done in the back room of the feed store, which smelled like grain dust and something that might have been old leather, and the whole transaction took less time than Colter had expected. Pruitt had a standard document, 2 copies, and he seemed very eager to complete the paperwork and move on with his afternoon. Mara sat across from Colter at a table scarred with years of use, and she signed her name in a clear, steady hand. Not the careful, uncertain penmanship of someone who was nervous, but the practiced script of someone who had signed a great many documents and considered it routine. Colter noticed that. He noticed other things too, now that they were in the same room without the crowd and the noise. Her hands were steady, her breathing was even. She had one small bag beside her chair. One bag for a person moving to a new life in a new place, and it was packed with a precision that suggested she had thought carefully about exactly what she needed and what she could leave behind. When Pruitt finally left them to it, the room went quiet. "You didn't have to do that," Mara said. She had a measured voice, neither loud nor soft, the kind of voice that had decided not to waste itself. "I know," Colter said. "I want to understand why you did." He looked at her. He was trying to figure out how to say something that he hadn't quite sorted out himself yet, and he was not a man who was comfortable with words he hadn't sorted out. "You didn't flinch," he finally said. She looked at him for a moment. "That's it?" It was enough. She considered this. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "I'm not coming to be taken care of. If I go to your ranch, it's because I intend to work, and I have conditions." Colter almost smiled. "I didn't quite, but it was close." "What conditions?" "I need to see the books. The real books, not a summary. I need to know what the actual financial situation is before I can tell you whether anything can be done about it." "You know about ranching finances?" "I know about a great many things," she said, and there was no arrogance in it, just the plain statement of a fact. "Do you want to discuss whether I'm qualified, or do you want to save your ranch?" Colter looked at his hands on the table. They were hands that had worked hard for 15 years and had not managed to solve the problem in front of him. "Fair enough," he said. They rode out to the Fallen Creek Ranch that afternoon in Colter's wagon, which had a seat that tilted slightly to the right and springs that had given up entirely on the left side. The road from Red Hollow was rough, and the country on either side of it was the particular dry, exhausted landscape of a region that hadn't had enough rain in 3 years. The grass was pale and thin. The few trees they passed were dusty and subdued. Mara sat on the tilting seat and looked at the land without saying anything, and Colter let her look. He had run out of things to say about the land years ago and had made his peace with the silence. After about 20 minutes, she said, "What's that drainage line there?" Colter looked where she was pointing, a slight depression in the field to the east, running in a gentle curve toward a low rise. "That's nothing, just the way the ground runs." "It's not nothing," she said. She kept looking at it even as the wagon moved past. "That's the remnant of a seasonal water channel. Something ran there once. The soil composition would be different." She paused. "Do you know if there was ever a well dug in that area?" Colter thought about it. "Not that I know of. My father talked once about there being a spring somewhere on the east section, but it dried up before his time, or so he said." Mara nodded slowly, still looking at the land even after the depression was behind them. "Springs don't always dry up," she said. "Sometimes they just need to be found again." Colter didn't say anything to that. He didn't want to hope for something he couldn't see yet. Hope, in his experience, was expensive. The ranch house was not in good condition, but it was not as bad as it could have been, which was the best that could be said for it. Colter had kept the inside clean out of a stubbornness that had more to do with his mother's standards than any practical consideration. The furniture was sparse and worn, but the floors were swept and the windows let in the afternoon light, and there were no leaks in the roof that hadn't been patched. Mara walked through the house the way she had looked at the land, methodically, taking her time, not commenting. Colter followed, trying to see the place through someone else's eyes and finding the experience uncomfortable. When they reached the kitchen, she stopped at the table and turned to face him. "I'm going to need 3 things from you," she said. "What 3 things?" "Your complete honesty about the debt, your patience with methods you haven't tried before, and your trust." She paused. "Not all at once. Trust takes time, but eventually." Colter leaned against the doorframe. "And what do I get?" "A fair shot," she said, "which is more than you have now." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without shifting, without performing either confidence or vulnerability, just present in the way that some people are present, solidly, occupying the space they stood in without apology. "The books are in the study," he said. "Second shelf, left side, 3 ledgers." Something in her expression eased slightly. "I'll start tonight." That first evening, Colter sat on the porch while the light drained out of the sky and tried to make sense of the day he had just had. He had gone to the auction meaning to observe and returned with a wife. He had done it because of the way she stood on a platform while 200 people laughed at her, which was either the most significant thing he had ever noticed about another person or the strangest reason a man had ever acquired a marriage. Through the window he could see the lamp in the study burning. He could hear faintly the sound of pages turning. Denton would think he'd lost his mind. The rest of the town would agree. Victor Blackwell would find the whole thing amusing, at least until he found it inconvenient. And from what Colter knew of Victor, inconvenience had a way of becoming something sharper. But Colter sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and he listened to the pages turning inside his house, and for the first time in 2 years he did not feel entirely alone in what he was facing. He didn't know yet what Mara Whitmore was capable of. He didn't know what she had left behind in Pennsylvania or why, didn't know what the ledgers were going to tell her or what she would do with the information. He didn't know if the East Section drainage line led to anything, or if hope was still as expensive as it had always been. But somewhere in the failing dark, with his boots still making that small slapping sound every time he shifted his feet, Colter Hayes made a decision that felt less like optimism and more like defiance. He was going to find out. The ledgers were worse than Colter had let himself admit. Mara sat at the study desk past midnight with the lamp turned up as high as it would go, and she went through all 3 books twice, not because she hadn't understood them the first time, but because she wanted to be certain she hadn't misread something. She hadn't. The numbers were clear, and they told a story that had been building for at least 4 years, possibly longer, depending on how far back the original decisions had been made. The debt to the Graysville Bank was the largest problem, but it was not the only problem. There were outstanding balances on equipment that had been purchased on credit during a better season and never fully paid off. There were 2 promissory notes, one to a feed supplier in Mill Haven, one to a man named Garrett, whose relationship to the ranch Mara couldn't yet determine from the paperwork alone. The cattle numbers had dropped by almost 40% over 3 years, and the revenue from what remained barely covered the operational costs, let alone the debt service. But the thing that stopped her, the thing she went back to 3 times before she was willing to trust what she was seeing, was a line item in the second ledger from 2 years ago. A payment, a significant one, nearly $300, made out to Blackwell Land Management. She wrote the amount down on a separate piece of paper and set it aside. When she finally went to bed, it was past 2 in the morning, and the house was completely quiet except for the sound of the wind working at the eaves. She lay on the narrow bed in the spare room with her hands folded on her chest and stared at the ceiling and thought about drainage lines and promissory notes and the particular way Victor Blackwell had smiled when the crowd laughed. She had seen men like Victor before. She had dealt with men like Victor before. The geography changed and the names changed and the specific details of their schemes changed, but the essential shape of it was always the same. A man who had figured out that the best way to acquire things was to wait until other people were desperate enough to let them go cheap. The question was not whether Victor was doing something to Colter's ranch. The question was exactly what, and whether she could prove it. She was still thinking about that when she fell asleep. Colter was up before dawn, which was his habit, and he was surprised to find the study lamp already extinguished and the ledgers stacked neatly on the corner of the desk with a folded piece of paper on top. He opened the paper and read what Mara had written in her clear hand, a list, organized by category, of every debt and liability on the ranch, with the amounts totaled at the bottom. Beside several items, she had written questions. Beside the Blackwell Land Management entry, she had written only, "Need to discuss, urgent." He was on his second cup of coffee when she came into the kitchen. She had dark circles under her eyes that she didn't try to hide, and her hair was pinned up but less carefully than the day before, a few strands loose at the sides. She looked at the coffee pot, and he got up without being asked and poured her a cup. "You saw the note," she said. "I did." "Tell me about the Blackwell payment." Colter sat back down. He wrapped both hands around his cup. 2 years ago, there was a grazing rights dispute with a neighboring property. The boundary line had never been formally surveyed, and Victor, Blackwell, offered to mediate. His company handled the paperwork. There was a fee. $300 is not a mediation fee, Mara said flatly. That's a controlling interest. Colter looked at her. What do you mean? Depending on what those documents actually say, not what you were told they say, but what they actually say. Blackwell Land Management may have a partial claim on your east pasture. She paused, watching his face. Did you read the full agreement before you signed it? The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who already knew the answer to a question and doesn't want to say it out loud. Colter. It was 40 pages, he said. And my lawyer at the time was Fletcher Gaines. He's retired now, and he told me it was standard. Fletcher Gaines has done business with Victor Blackwell for 20 years, Mara said. I saw his name in your second ledger as well. He notarized the document. Colter set his coffee cup down. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't know yet. I'm saying I need to see the original agreement, not the summary, and I need to read every word of it. She looked at him steadily. And I'm saying that until we know what we're actually dealing with, you should not sign anything else that has Blackwell's name on it. Nothing. Not a receipt, not a renewal, nothing. He looked at the table. There was a grain in the wood that he had traced with his thumb 100 times without ever deciding to, just the way a hand finds familiar shapes. The bank in Graysville has a meeting scheduled for next month, he said. Craddock wants a repayment plan or he's moving toward foreclosure. What are your options if the bank forecloses? There aren't any. There are always options, she said. Some of them are just worse than others. She picked up her coffee and drank. I need to ride the east section today. Will you take me? The east section was the part of the ranch that Colter had essentially given up on. The soil there was harder, the grass thinner, and the cattle had stopped grazing it heavily 2 seasons ago because they had learned the way cattle learn things that it wasn't worth the effort. He had been meaning to reassess it and hadn't gotten around to it because reassessing things you'd already mentally written off required a particular kind of energy he hadn't had. Mara did not approach it like someone looking at a loss. She approached it like someone reading a document written in a language she knew, and Colter didn't. She rode slowly, stopping frequently, dismounting twice to crouch down and press her hand flat against the soil, pick up a handful and let it run through her fingers. She studied the terrain without talking, and Colter rode beside her and let her work, asking nothing. At the drainage depression she had noticed from the wagon, she stopped for a long time. She walked the length of it on foot. It ran maybe 60 yards from east to west, and she looked at the way the ground on either side of it sat differently, subtly, the way you might not notice unless you were looking for it. "The soil here is darker," she said, "even at the surface. You can see it if you compare it to what's 15 feet in either direction." She turned to him. "Your father mentioned a spring. That was his father's time, or maybe earlier, I don't know the details. Springs in this kind of terrain don't disappear," she said. "They go underground. The water table shifts, or something blocks the outlet, and the spring goes subsurface. But it's still there." She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands. "If we dig in the right place, there's a real chance we find water." Not a guaranteed chance, but real. Colter looked at the ground. He was trying to be careful with how much he let himself feel about this. What does digging cost? Less than losing the ranch. He almost laughed. Came out more like an exhale. Fair point. When they rode back through the north field, they passed within sight of the fence line that separated Fallen Creek from the property to its east, the property that had been at the center of the boundary dispute 2 years ago. A man was working the fence on the other side, and he stopped when he saw them and straightened up slowly with the deliberate movement of someone deciding whether to acknowledge another person. His name was Roy Pettis. He was 60 or so, with a face like dried creek bed, and eyes that had the slightly distant quality of someone who had seen a lot of trouble and stopped being surprised by it. He had been farming that land since before Colter was born, and the two of them had a history that was neither friendly nor hostile, but occupied the complicated space between those things that long-term neighbors sometimes inhabit. Roy looked at Mara with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a man who doesn't bother to pretend he's not curious about things. He looked at her for a few seconds without saying anything, then looked at Colter. "Heard you got married," Roy said. "Yesterday," Colter said. Roy nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking about. "Blackwell know yet?" "Why would Blackwell need to know?" Roy put his fence tool down on the post and pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his white hair. It was the gesture of a man choosing his next words carefully. "Just that he's been watching your situation, the way he watches things." He put his hat back on. "That east pasture of yours. You get the agreement sorted with his company yet? About the boundary?" "What do you know about the agreement?" Colter said. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was keeping something out of it. Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. "You the one who's going to be running things?" he asked her, direct as a nail. Mara held his gaze. "Partly," she said. Roy nodded again, slowly, like he was filing that away. "Then you'd want to know that Blackwell's been telling people he has a right of first purchase on that east section if Hayes ever defaults. Said it was in the mediation agreement." He picked up his fence tool again and turned back to the wire. "Just what I heard." He said it the way people sometimes deliver the most important information, casually, as if it were a footnote, looking away rather than watching to see how it landed. Colter looked at Mara. Mara looked at the fence line for a moment. Then she said quietly, "We need that agreement today." They found it in the bottom drawer of the study desk, in a folder that had been placed under 2 years of correspondence and tax receipts. The folder was labeled, in Fletcher Gaines's spidery handwriting, East Pasture, Boundary Resolution, 1985. It was 43 pages, and the language in it was the kind of legal language that is specifically designed to be understood only by people who write it. Mara read it at the kitchen table, while Colter made a meal that was more functional than good. Salt pork, some beans he'd had soaking since morning, bread that was 2 days old but still acceptable. She read while he cooked, and she read while they ate, and she was still reading when he cleared the plates. He watched her face while she read, the way it shifted through things she was processing. A small tightening around the eyes here, a slight pause there, twice the barely visible movement of her lips as she went back over a sentence she wanted to read again. Finally, she set the document down and looked at the table for a moment before she looked at him. "It's in here," she said. "Section 14, subsection C. If the primary deed holder of Fallen Creek Ranch fails to meet any scheduled debt obligation within the next 5 years from the date of signing, that's this year, 1887, Blackwell Land Management has the right to purchase the east section at a price set by their own assessor." She paused. Not a market price. Their price. Colter was quiet for a moment. Fletcher told me it was a standard right-of-way clause. It's not a right-of-way clause. Her voice was even, but there was something under it. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to anger. The kind of controlled heat that comes from seeing something done to someone that didn't need to be done. It's a predatory option. If you miss a payment, one payment, it doesn't say how large, Blackwell gets to buy your most potentially valuable land at whatever he decides it's worth. The most potentially valuable, Colter repeated. The east section. The east section, where we think there's water. The kitchen went quiet enough that Colter could hear the lamp. He knew, Colter said. It wasn't a question. I think someone knew, Mara said carefully. Whether Victor himself identified the water potential or whether he simply recognized that the east section was the most logical area for future development, either way, yes. This agreement was designed to get him that land when you were vulnerable. She folded the document back along its original creases. And the drought made the timing convenient. Colter pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. He was doing the thing he did when he was trying to hold on to himself. He could feel it, the way anger wanted to come in fast and hot, and he needed it not to, because hot anger made you stupid, and he couldn't afford to be stupid. What do? He said. First, we find out if the clause is legally enforceable, Mara said. Fletcher Gaines wrote it in language that sounds legitimate, but there are several elements here that are questionable, depending on the territorial statutes. She paused. Do you know a lawyer? One who doesn't have a relationship with Blackwell? There's a man in Graysville, name of Abbott. I've met him twice. He does land work mostly. Can you get to Graysville this week? I can go Thursday. Then we go Thursday, she said. But Colter, she waited until he turned from the window. This is going to take time. And while we're working on the legal question, we need to also be working on the ranch itself. Because if the clause isn't enforceable, but you're still in default, the bank is still coming. We need to be solving both problems at the same time. He looked at her across the kitchen. She had one hand flat on the folded document and the other around her coffee cup, and there was nothing performed about her composure, no effort in it, just the natural state of someone who had thought things through and was ready to start. You've done this before, he said. Not accusing, just recognizing something. She looked at him. Done what? Walked into something that looked like a lost cause and started pulling threads. She held his gaze for a moment. Get some sleep, she said. We start early. Well, the next morning she was up before him. He found her in the barn, walking slowly through the stalls, looking at the cattle with the same methodical attention she had given everything else. She had a small notebook. He hadn't seen it before. She must have had it in her bag. And she was making notes in it as she moved through the space. His ranch hand, a young man named Pete Calder, who was 22 and had the permanent expression of someone slightly confused by the world, was watching her from a safe distance, with the specific wariness of a person who doesn't know how to categorize what they're seeing. Pete had worked at Fallen Creek for 3 years and was reasonably competent, but had a deep conservatism about change that expressed itself mostly through silence and skepticism. When Colter came in, Pete pulled him aside immediately with the urgency of a man with important news. She's been in here an hour, he said, low, as if Mara might not notice them talking about her from 30 feet away. She went through all the feed stores, counted the cattle. She asked me what route we use for the grazing rotation. What did you tell her? I told her the route. Same one we've always used. He paused. She wrote it down and then she said, he seemed to be working out how to report this. She said the route was adding 2 miles a day of unnecessary walking and the cattle were burning off weight they couldn't afford to lose. Colter looked over at Mara, who had moved to the far end of the barn and was examining the condition of the last stall. She's right, he said. Pete blinked. You knew? I knew something was off with the weight. I didn't know what was causing it. He looked at Pete. Whatever she asks you, answer straight. And whatever she suggests, try it. Pete looked at him, the way Pete looked at most things he didn't fully understand. She's your wife, he said carefully, as if reminding Colter of a relevant fact. She is, Colter said, and she knows what she's doing. Whether Pete believed that or not, he was at least willing to act on the instruction. Over the following days, Mara began making changes to the ranch's operations with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of someone working through a list in their head. She redesigned the grazing rotation so the cattle were covering less ground and spending more time on the better grass. She renegotiated the terms with the feed supplier in Millhaven through a letter she drafted herself. Cool, precise, specific about what the ranch needed and what it could offer. And the supplier wrote back inside a week with revised terms that were better than anything Colter had managed to negotiate in 3 years. She asked Colter for the history of the water situation in detail. Not just the drought years, but the years before. The seasonal patterns, where the land had been wettest and when. She asked Pete questions that Pete had never been asked, and that sometimes required Pete to go home and think about it and come back the next morning with an answer. She walked the property at different times of day, sometimes early when the light was flat, and sometimes at midday when the heat made the air shimmer. And she made notes in her small notebook that were dense with information she didn't share, and that Colter didn't ask about because he had begun to understand that she was building something in her head, assembling pieces, and interrupting the process before she was ready to talk about it would be like pulling at the threads of something still being woven. The town noticed, because small towns always notice. Colter had not expected otherwise, but the specific form the noticing took was sometimes surprising and sometimes not. Denton came by on the 4th day and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and said hello to Mara, with the careful politeness of a man who has decided something and isn't sure yet whether he's right. He asked Colter, while Mara was out of earshot, whether she was working out. Colter said yes. Denton looked at the barn and nodded and left without saying what he thought, which was unusual for Denton and probably represented a kind of respect. 2 women from town, a Mrs. Garfield and a woman named Sherry Oakes, whose husband had the hardware store, came by on the 6th day under the pretext of welcoming a new neighbor. They brought a pie that was perfectly fine and sat in the kitchen and talked at Mara with the particular bright sociability of people who are doing reconnaissance. Mara answered their questions politely, gave them nothing useful, and thanked them for the pie with a warmth that was genuine but revealed nothing. After they left, Colter asked what she had made of them. She said, "They're not the problem, but they'll tell the problem everything they saw." He hadn't needed to ask who she meant by the problem. On the 8th day, a man named Cliff Arden rode up to the property and stopped at the fence line and called for Colter. He was one of Victor Blackwell's men, not a foreman exactly, more of a person Victor sent when he wanted to communicate something without communicating it directly. Cliff was polite in the mechanical way of someone following instructions about tone. He told Colter that Mr. Blackwell wanted to let him know that the bank in Graysville had been in touch. Routine correspondence, he said, just keeping the interested parties informed, and that if Mr. Hayes found himself in a difficult position with the upcoming repayment deadline, Mr. Blackwell would be happy to discuss options. Colter listened to all of this standing at the fence with his arms at his sides. "Tell Mr. Blackwell I appreciate it," he said. "He'd want me to say that the offer has a time limit," Cliff added, still polite. "The kind of offer that's easier to accept sooner than later." "I'll keep that in mind," Colter said. He waited until Cliff had ridden back down the road far enough that the dust had mostly settled, and then he went inside and found Mara in the study and told her what had been said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's nervous." Colter frowned. "He's putting pressure on." "Yes, but that's what nervous looks like from Victor Blackwell." She turned back to the desk. "Someone has told him we're looking into the east section, or he's noticed on his own that we've been spending time out there." She picked up a pen. "The offer coming now before the repayment deadline means he's not sure he can wait." "Why would he be unsure?" She looked at him. "Because if we find water before he acquires the land, the terms change entirely. The clause in that agreement sets the price based on current assessed value. Water changes the assessed value significantly." She paused. "He wants to move before we dig." Colter looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon was pale and dry, and a hawk was tracing circles over the east field, in that way hawks do when they've found something worth watching. "Then we dig first," he said. "We go to Graysville first," she said. "Thursday. We talk to Abbott. Then we dig." The trip to Graysville was a full day, there and back, and they left before sunrise with the wagon and the horse that had the better gait. Mara brought the original agreement in a leather case she borrowed from the study, and she sat on the wagon seat and read sections of it again while they traveled, occasionally making a small note in the margin with a pencil she kept behind her ear. Abbott's office was on the second floor of a building on Graysville's Main Street, above a printer's shop, and it smelled like old paper and ink and the leather of a great many well-used books. Abbott himself was a short man of about 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and the slightly preoccupied manner of someone whose mind is generally two subjects ahead of the current conversation. He shook Colter's hand, nodded at Mara, and sat down behind his desk and put his reading glasses on, and held out his hand for the document without saying anything else. He read it the way Mara had read it, methodically, without hurrying, going back occasionally on something he wanted to revisit. Colter and Mara sat across from him and waited. A clock on the shelf behind Abbott ticked. Somewhere below, the printer was running. After about 20 minutes, Abbott took his glasses off and set the document down and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the reflective way of a man sorting through what he's going to say. "Well," he said, "this is creative." "Is it enforceable?" Mara asked. Abbott put his glasses back on and picked up the document again and found the relevant section. "Section 14, subsection C," he said, confirming that he had found what she had found. He read it again, lips moving slightly. Then he put the document down again. "It's not cleanly enforceable," he said. "The territorial statutes on right of purchase agreements require the purchasing price to be determined by a neutral third-party assessor, not by the purchasing party. The language here specifies Blackwell's assessor, which violates that requirement." He paused. However, Mara repeated. "However, if Blackwell were to exercise the clause and Hayes were to challenge it, it would go to a territorial court, and the outcome would depend significantly on which judge heard it. The clause was drafted to look legitimate at first reading, and a judge who didn't look carefully, or who—" He stopped. "Or who had a prior relationship with Blackwell," Mara said. Abbott looked at her for the first time with something more than polite professional attention. It was a brief assessment, the kind of look that happens when a person recalibrates their understanding of who they're talking to. "Or that," he said. "Yes." "What would make it unambiguously unenforceable?" she asked. "Evidence of fraudulent intent in the original drafting," Abbott said. "If you could demonstrate that the clause was inserted deliberately to obscure its nature from the signer, and that the person who reviewed the document on Hayes's behalf was aware of that intent." He paused again, more carefully this time. "That would be a different matter entirely. That wouldn't be a contract dispute. That would be fraud." The room was quiet for a moment. "Fletcher Gaines," Colter said. Abbott looked at him steadily. "I didn't say a name." "No," Colter said. "I did." Abbott picked up the document and squared its edges on his desk. "I'll need 2 days to prepare a formal opinion," he said, "in writing, and I would recommend you hold on to the original agreement and do not let it out of your custody under any circumstances." He looked from Colter to Mara. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" "One thing," Mara said. "If Blackwell attempts to exercise the clause before the 5-year term expires on a missed payment, can he be enjoined?" Abbott blinked. Then he said carefully, "Are you asking whether you can get a court order preventing him from acting on it while the validity of the clause is under legal review?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been in his profession for 25 years and is mildly startled to be having this particular conversation in this particular context. "Theoretically, yes," he said. "It would require filing quickly and on solid grounds. But if the grounds are there—" He nodded slowly. "Yes." On the drive back from Graysville, they didn't talk much for the first hour. The sun was dropping toward the western hills, and the light had gone gold and horizontal, the kind of light that makes the dry country look like something it isn't, more beautiful and more forgiving than it actually is. Colter drove and thought about Fletcher Gaines, who had been his lawyer for 4 years, who had shaken his hand and told him the agreement was standard, who had notarized a document designed to take away his land. "You knew," he said eventually, "about the clause, before Abbott confirmed it." "I thought I knew," Mara said. "There's a difference." "How did you know what to look for?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I've seen how people lose things," she said. "Not dramatically. Not in one disaster. In small agreements they didn't read carefully, in fees that weren't what they were described as, in one compromise that seemed reasonable and then became the reason for the next compromise." She paused. "The mechanisms are usually similar. The language changes, but the structure is the same." Where did you learn that? She looked at the road ahead. I'll tell you more about that when the time is right, she said. Not because I'm hiding it, because right now what matters is what we do with it. He accepted that. It wasn't entirely satisfying, but he accepted it because she was right that it wasn't what mattered most right now, and because he had begun to understand that Mara operated on her own timeline about what she revealed and when, and that the timeline was considered and not arbitrary. 2 days after they returned from Graysville, Pete came to the house in the early afternoon and knocked on the study door and said that Harlan Briggs was at the fence line wanting to talk. Harlan Briggs ran the largest of the neighboring ranches to the west, a sprawling operation called the Double Spur that had been in his family for decades. He was 63, heavy-set, with white hair and the blunt manner of a man who had made a great deal of money by being right about things more often than he was wrong. He and Colter had a respectful but not warm relationship. They cooperated on water sharing during dry seasons and otherwise kept out of each other's way. He did not come often. The last time he had come to Fallen Creek had been 3 years ago. Colter went out to the fence and they shook hands, and Harlan said he'd heard some things and wanted to ask directly. You got somebody helping you sort out the Blackwell situation? He said. Where did you hear about a Blackwell situation? Colter said. Harlan looked at him with the patience of someone who doesn't need to explain how information travels in a small county. Is it true? Colter thought about what Mara had said about Cliff Arden's visit, meaning Victor was nervous. He thought about what it meant that Harlan Briggs was here asking this question. I'm looking into some things, yes, he said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and looked at the east section in the distance. That agreement Blackwell got your signature on, he said. The mediation business. What about it? He got mine too, Harlan said. 2 years ago, different pretext. Drainage easement. He looked at Colter. I had my grandson read it recently. Kid just finished his legal training in the city, and apparently, he stopped. He had the expression of a man who doesn't enjoy saying he was taken. Apparently, it's not what I was told it was. The two of them stood at the fence in the afternoon light and looked at each other with the specific understanding of men who have each realized, separately and at different speeds, that they have been outmaneuvered by the same person for the same purpose. You want to come in? Colter said. Yeah, Harlan said. I think I'd better. What? Mara listened to Harlan Briggs describe his agreement with Blackwell Land Management with the same focused attention she brought to everything, her notebook open and her pencil moving. She asked him several questions, precise, specific, the kind that pointed to exactly the details she needed rather than the details that were easiest to give. Harlan answered them with a thoroughness he might not have given a different interviewer, because there was something about the way Mara asked questions that made it easier to answer completely than to answer approximately. When he finished, Mara set down her pencil and looked at her notes. How many ranchers in this county do you think Blackwell has similar agreements with? She said. Harlan thought about it. If he's done it the same way with me and Hayes, methodical, small amounts, different pretexts. He rubbed his jaw. Could be a dozen. Could be more. And if the same pattern appears in a dozen agreements, Mara said, looking at neither of them in particular, just the middle distance of someone thinking out loud, that stops being a contract dispute. Harlan looked at Colter. Colter looked at Mara. It becomes a pattern, Colter said slowly. It becomes evidence, Mara said. Abbott needs to see Harlan's agreement too. She looked up. And I need to know if any of the others would be willing to come forward. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Some will, he said. Some won't. Blackwell has a hand in enough people's livelihoods that some of them will be afraid of what it costs to cross him. He paused. But some have been angry for a long time. Angry is useful, Mara said, as long as it's organized. She said it simply, without drama, the way she said most things. But it landed in the room with a particular weight, and Harlan Briggs, who had not been told much about the woman Colter Hayes had brought home from an auction, and who had formed whatever impressions he'd formed from the things people said in the ways people said them, looked at her with the expression of a man updating a considerable portion of his assumptions. He stayed for another hour. He left with Abbott's address in his pocket and a list of 4 names Mara had asked him to contact quietly. After he left, Pete came in from the barn and said he'd been thinking about the route change for the cattle and had a question about the timing of the morning rotation, and Colter answered it, and they talked through the logistics of the next week, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of the stew Mara had put on the stove an hour ago. It was a domestic, ordinary scene. Someone who didn't know what was happening under the surface of it would have seen a ranch household at the end of a working day. Colter watched Mara add something to the stew and make a note in her book at the same time, and thought about the morning 5 days ago when he had signed his name on a document in the back of a feed store while a crowd outside continued not to care what happened to either of them. He thought about Victor Blackwell's smile. He thought about water underground, waiting to be found. He did not let himself call it hope yet, but he didn't stop it from being something. Abbott's written opinion arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a plain envelope that Pete brought in from the road with the rest of the mail without knowing what it contained. Mara was in the east section when it arrived, and Colter set it on the study desk and waited for her rather than opening it himself. I wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the way things had been unfolding made him feel that the envelope belonged to both of them, that opening it alone would be doing it wrong. She came in an hour later with dust on her boots and her notebook full of new markings, and she saw the envelope on the desk and picked it up and read it standing, still in her coat. Colter watched her face. Abbott had written 6 pages in his careful, compressed handwriting. The conclusion occupied the last paragraph of the final page, and when Mara reached it, she stopped moving entirely for about 10 seconds. Then she set the letter down on the desk and looked at Colter. "The clause is fraudulent," she said, in Abbott's professional opinion. The specific language used to describe the pricing mechanism was drawn from a Missouri statute that does not apply in this territory, which means whoever drafted it either didn't know territorial law, which Abbott considers unlikely given the sophistication of the rest of the document, or used it deliberately because it creates an appearance of legitimacy without actually having it. She paused. He also says that the notarization by Fletcher Gaines constitutes a material problem for Gaines personally, because a licensed notary is required to certify that the signatories understood what they were signing, which means Gaines either confirmed something he knew was false, or he was negligent to the point of professional misconduct. Colter was quiet for a moment. "Either way, Gaines is in trouble." "Either way, Gaines is in trouble," Mara confirmed. "And Abbott says that if we can establish similar patterns in other agreements, which means getting the other ranchers to bring their documents to him, he can make a case for a coordinated scheme." She picked up the letter again and found the specific line. He uses the word conspiracy, not loosely. The word sat in the room. Colter walked to the window. Outside, Pete was moving the cattle through the revised rotation Mara had designed, the route that cut 2 unnecessary miles from the daily circuit. Even from a distance, Colter could see that the pace was different, less urgent, more settled. Small things. They added up. "Victor is going to find out we've been to Abbott," he said. "He probably already knows," Mara said. "Graysville isn't much bigger than Red Hollow when it comes to who knows whose business." She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. "What matters is whether we can move faster than he does." The digging started that Thursday. Colter had hired 2 men from town, brothers named Will and Sam Tate, who did well work in general labor and were known for being dependable and for asking fewer questions than most people. He had not told them why he was digging in the east section specifically, only that he had reason to believe there might be a subsurface water source and he wanted to explore it. Will and Sam had accepted this with the equanimity of men whose business did not require them to understand the reasoning behind the requests they fulfilled. Mara had marked 3 sites along the drainage depression with small wooden stakes, ranked in order of her assessment of their likelihood. She had used the soil composition, the topography, and what she knew about how subsurface water moved through this kind of terrain to make the call. She was not a surveyor, and she had said so plainly when Colter asked her how confident she was. "I'm confident in my reasoning," she had said. "I'm not confident in the outcome. Those are different things." The first site produced nothing useful after 2 days of digging, hard clay at 8 feet that the brothers declared unlikely to break into anything productive. Mara accepted this without visible disappointment and redirected them to the second stake. Pete watched the digging operation from a careful distance for the first 2 days and then began to drift closer, the way Pete drifted toward things he was curious about but didn't want to admit he was curious about. On the 3rd day, he was standing at the edge of the dig site, asking Will Tate questions about the soil composition, and Mara watched this from where she was standing and said nothing, but Colter saw her make a note in her book and suspected it was about Pete, On the morning of the 5th day, Victor Blackwell came. He came alone, which was unusual for him. Victor generally preferred to have at least one other person present when he conducted business, a preference that served the dual purpose of providing a witness and reinforcing the impression of a man important enough to require company. The fact that he came alone suggested he had decided this visit required a different kind of approach. He rode up the main road to the property and stopped at the gate and called out in a voice that carried well, and Colter went out to meet him. Victor looked at the gate between them with the expression of a man deciding whether to be offended. Then he looked past Colter at the house and the barn and the general state of the property with the assessing gaze of someone calculating. "I heard you've been improving things," he said. It was offered as a compliment, though not a warm one, more like an acknowledgement of a fact he had expected to be able to dismiss and found he couldn't. "Trying," Colter said. "And your wife?" Victor's tone shifted only slightly, but it shifted. "I've heard she's been quite involved." "She has." Victor looked at Colter with the measured patience of a man who has decided to take his time. "You know, Hayes, I've always thought you were a reasonable man. Not always the most informed about certain things, but reasonable." He paused. "A reasonable man knows when a situation is better resolved quietly than not." "What situation would that be?" Colter said. "The agreement," Victor said, and there was no more pretense of indirectness. "The one you apparently took to a lawyer in Graysville, a man named Abbott, I understand." "I'm allowed to seek legal counsel," Colter said. "Of course you are." Victor's smile was the one Colter had seen at the auction, the one that knew exactly what it was doing. "And Abbott is allowed to have opinions, professional opinions even, but opinions and outcomes are different things, as I'm sure you've considered." He leaned slightly on his saddle horn. "I want you to understand something. What I offered through Cliff still stands. The right of purchase at a fair price, and I mean a genuinely fair price, Hayes, not a punitive one, for the East section. That resolves the agreement entirely. You get capital, you service the bank debt, you keep the rest of the ranch intact, and you get the East section. I get land I have a legitimate interest in," Victor said, which was always the arrangement. Colter looked at him. He thought about the letter in Abbott's handwriting sitting in the study. He thought about the word conspiracy in the last paragraph. He thought about Harlan Briggs sitting in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had learned something about himself he hadn't wanted to learn. "I'll think about it," Colter said. Victor studied him for a moment. "Don't think too long," he said. "The bank's patience is a resource, and resources have limits." He straightened in the saddle. "Give my regards to your wife." He rode back down the road and Colter watched him go, and then went inside and found Mara in the study. "He was here," he said. She didn't look up from what she was reading. "I know. I saw from the window." She turned a page. "What did he say?" Colter told her, word for word as close as he could manage it. Mara listened without interrupting, which was her habit. She took in information completely before she responded to it, a discipline that Colter had started to find himself trying to imitate in his own thinking with limited success. When he finished, she put down what she was reading and looked at the window. "He's not nervous anymore," she said. "He knows about Abbott. He's adjusting." She paused. "Which means he has something in reserve that he thinks neutralizes what Abbott found." "What could that be?" "The judge," she said. "Or the bank. Or both." She turned to face him fully. "Craddock at the Graysville Bank. What is his relationship with Blackwell exactly?" Colter thought about it. "They're on the same church council, or they were. I know Blackwell has accounts at the Graysville Bank, commercial accounts, big ones." "A major depositor and a local judge," Mara said. "That's not an accident, that's infrastructure." She stood up from the desk. "We need to move faster on the other ranchers. How many has Harlan reached?" He said 4 were willing to come forward with their documents. There may be 2 more. 6, plus yours and Harlan's, that's 8 agreements. If Abbott can review all 8 and establish the pattern, then it stops being a local dispute that one judge can quietly dispose of. She paused. "We need to take this to the territorial level. Not just Abbott filing in county court. We need someone in the territorial administration to take an interest." Colter looked at her. "How do we make that happen?" "You let me work on that," she said. It wasn't evasive. It was just how she said things when she had a direction in mind but wasn't ready to explain it, because the explanation depended on things she hadn't confirmed yet. He had learned to read the difference. The water came on a Sunday. Mara had not been expecting Sunday specifically. Water didn't organize itself around the working week. But there was something about the timing that felt stubborn and uncooperative in a way that the whole situation had been stubborn and uncooperative. And so finding it on the one day when Will and Sam Tate weren't scheduled to work, and it was Pete and Colter and Mara alone at the second dig site, had a slightly absurd quality that Mara privately appreciated. They had gone down 11 feet at the second stake, which was deeper than she had initially calculated, and she had been quietly revising her assessment downward for 2 days. Not abandoning it, her reasoning about the drainage line remained sound, but adjusting for the possibility that the water table in this specific location was sitting lower than the topographic indicators had suggested. Pete had been doing the digging that morning while Colter handled a broken section of fence on the north boundary, and Mara had been at the site recording measurements when Pete's shovel hit something that changed the sound. Not dramatically. Not in the way it happens in stories where someone strikes water and it comes rushing up. It was a change in the density of the soil, a darkening, a give, and then, slowly, the appearance of moisture at the bottom of the shaft. Pete stood in the hole and stared at the dark soil around the blade of his shovel and said, "Mrs. Hayes?" His voice had a quality Mara had not heard from him before. Not excitement exactly. Pete was constitutionally resistant to excitement, but something that was excitement's more contained cousin. "I see it," she said. "Is that—" "Yes," she said. "Go get Colter." Pete climbed out of the hole with more speed than he usually brought to any task and went at a half run across the east section, and Mara crouched at the edge of the shaft and looked down at the moisture spreading slowly through the exposed soil. She had been right about the drainage line. She had been right about the spring. She had been right about the soil composition and the subsurface movement and the direction the water was traveling. She had been right about all of it, and crouching at the edge of a hole in the ground on a dry Sunday morning, on a ranch that was still technically in debt to a bank, and legally threatened by a man who had been doing it for years, she allowed herself a moment that was purely private. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the specific feeling of a thing she had thought was true turning out to actually be true. It was one of the quieter satisfactions, and not something she showed anyone. By the time Colter arrived, moving at a speed she hadn't seen from him before, she had stood back up and was writing in her notebook. He looked at the shaft. He looked at the moisture. He crouched down the way Pete had crouched down and looked at it from close range. And she watched his face from a few feet away and saw something move through it that was harder to name than what she'd seen in Pete. Something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he might be able to set it down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "My father was right. About the spring." He kept saying there was water under the east section. People told him he was imagining it. He looked at the shaft for another moment. He died thinking it was gone. Mara didn't say anything to that. Some things didn't need a response, and she had learned early in life that the impulse to fill a silence was not always worth acting on. After a moment, Colter stood up. "What does this change?" "Everything and nothing," she said. "It doesn't change the debt. It doesn't change the agreement with Blackwell or what Abbott found in it, but it changes the asset value of this land significantly, which is exactly why Blackwell has been trying to acquire it before we had evidence of what's here." She closed her notebook. "And it means that the price Blackwell was proposing to pay under the clause is so far below actual value that it makes the fraudulent intent clearer." "It makes the case better," Colter said. "It makes the case considerably better." She looked at the shaft and then at the surrounding land, the pale grass, the hard terrain, the long, slow curve of the drainage depression stretching away to the east. "We need to get a formal water survey done, a surveyor who can document the source, estimate the volume, assess the catchment. That becomes evidence." She paused. "Abbott will want this." The news about the water reached Red Hollow before Colter had decided to share it, which was how news generally traveled in small places. Not through deliberate disclosure, but through the particular atmospheric quality of settled communities, where people know each other's movements and can read significance into a change in pattern. Pete had told his cousin, who worked at the feed store, who had mentioned it to 2 people by mid-morning Monday. By Tuesday afternoon, the quality of the town's attention to the Fallen Creek Ranch had changed in a way that was subtle but perceptible to Mara, who paid attention to such things. People who had not acknowledged her on the street now nodded. The woman at the dry goods counter, who had been previously capable of helping her with purchases while maintaining the remarkable achievement of near-complete eye contact avoidance, looked directly at her and said good morning. Small shifts. The kind that happen when a town begins to revise its assessment of what something is worth. Not everyone was revising. Mrs. Garfield, whom people who were not themselves the problem, but who would tell the problem everything they'd seen, had apparently been very thorough in her reporting. There was a group of women, 4 or 5, the precise membership seemed to vary, who had decided that the appropriate response to Mara's presence in Red Hollow was a sustained and coordinated disapproval expressed through the specific social mechanisms available to women who didn't have access to legal or economic levers. They didn't speak to her directly. They spoke about things in her presence. They had a way of going quiet in a particular register when she entered a room that was different from ordinary silence. Mara had encountered this before. She had encountered more sophisticated versions of it. She navigated it the way she navigated most things, by deciding which parts of it were worth her attention and which parts were not, and acting accordingly. What she could not navigate around was the conversation that happened at Haggerty's General Store on a Wednesday morning when she had gone in for lamp oil and thread and found herself in the same space as Clara Rudd, whose husband managed one of Blackwell's commercial properties, and who had apparently decided that directness was more useful than the oblique approach. Clara Rudd was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with the manner of someone who had learned that being unpleasant was a form of power when other forms were unavailable. She waited until Mara was at the counter and the store owner had gone to the back for the lamp oil, and then she said, loudly enough that the 2 other women in the store could hear perfectly, "I suppose you think you've done something clever." Mara set her thread on the counter and did not turn around immediately. She took a breath, the kind she used in difficult rooms, and then she turned. "Good morning, Mrs. Rudd," she said. Clara Rudd looked at her with the assessing hostility of someone who had prepared for several responses and wasn't sure which one this was going to require. "My husband says you've been stirring up the other ranchers," she said, "going to lawyers, making accusations." "I haven't made any accusations," Mara said. It was true, and she said it without defensiveness, just as a fact. "You've been spreading around the idea that Victor Blackwell has been doing something wrong," Clara said, which is the same thing. "Has anyone told you specifically what the concern is?" Mara asked. Clara's expression shifted slightly. "I know Victor Blackwell," she said. "I've known him 20 years. He built half of what this town depends on." "That may be true," Mara said. "The 2 things aren't mutually exclusive." Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who has come in looking for a fight and found something less satisfying. "People in this town have made up their minds about you," she said. "You might think things are changing because a few people are being polite, but that's just manners. It's not the same as respect." Mara held her gaze for a moment. "I know the difference," she said. The store owner came back with the lamp oil, and Mara paid for her things and left, and Clara Rudd stood behind her in the store with the unsatisfied expression of a person whose point hadn't quite landed the way she'd intended. Outside, Mara stood in the street for a moment and looked at the town around her, the dry storefronts, the rutted street, the 2 men talking outside the bank who hadn't noticed her yet. She had lived in a place like this before, not the same geography, not the same specific faces, but the same essential composition. Small communities had a grammar, and she had learned to read it. Clara Rudd was wrong about one thing and right about one thing. She was wrong about the polite people. So it wasn't just manners. Some of it was genuine recalibration, people deciding the situation was different from what they'd thought. But she was right that it wasn't the same as respect. Mara had not come to Red Hollow to be respected. She had come because she had made a decision about the life she wanted, and this was the life she had found herself in, and she intended to do what she could with it. She walked back to the wagon, and she did not let herself think about Clara Rudd for the rest of the morning. Victor moved on a Thursday. He moved, as people like Victor generally moved, through channels that looked legitimate until you understood what they were doing. The mechanism was Craddock at the Graysville Bank, who sent a letter to Colter, formal, correctly worded, professionally appropriate, indicating that given the current status of the outstanding debt, the bank had decided to accelerate the repayment timeline. What had been a monthly arrangement was now, effective in 30 days, a demand for settlement of the full outstanding balance. Colter read the letter twice, which was one more time than he needed to understand it, and then put it on the study desk and went to find Mara. She read it once and then set it next to Abbott's letter and looked at both of them for a moment. "He's using the bank to create the default condition that triggers the clause," she said. "He doesn't have to wait for us to miss a payment naturally. He manufactures the missed payment by making the full balance due immediately." She looked at Colter. "Which means the 30 days is also the timeline for the right of purchase clause." "Can he do that?" Colter said. "Accelerate the timeline?" "The bank can, yes. Depending on the terms of the original loan, most commercial lending agreements include an acceleration clause that lets the lender call the full balance on short notice." She looked at the letter again. "The question is whether Craddock's decision to use it right now, after Victor's conversation at the gate with you, in coordination with the right of purchase timing, whether that coordination constitutes something that can be challenged." She paused. "Abbott needs to see this today." Colter sent a rider to Graysville with the letter and a note for Abbott that same afternoon. Abbott's response came the following morning. He had sent it by the early rider, and it was terse in the way that Abbott became terse when he was thinking hard. "The acceleration is legal in isolation. The coordination with the Blackwell agreement may not be. I need 3 days. Do not respond to the bank until you hear from me. Do not sign anything. Abbott." 3 days was a particular kind of time when something was pressing from the other end. Colter moved through those days with the specific quality of tension that comes from having things to do and also things that cannot be done until something else happens first. He worked the ranch. The East Section water survey had been scheduled, and the surveyor was coming Friday. And he managed the cattle and the fencing and the daily operations, but underneath all of it was the constant awareness of the 30-day clock and what was at the end of it. Mara was working on something she hadn't explained yet. She spent 2 evenings writing letters, long ones, and she sealed them herself and gave them to Pete with specific instructions about which writer service to use and which addresses to send them to. Colter saw the letters, but not the addresses. He didn't ask. He understood by now that she would tell him when it was time to tell him. On the second of the 3 days, Harlan Briggs arrived with 2 other ranchers, a man named Caldwell, who ran a sheep operation on the South Ridge, and a woman named Frances Hobart, who was 60 and widowed and had managed her late husband's property with a competence that the county had been quietly surprised by for 12 years. Frances had never spoken to Mara before. She shook her hand at the door with the firm, evaluating grip of a woman who formed opinions through physical contact. They sat in the kitchen, 5 of them around a table not quite big enough, and they put their documents down. Harlan's drainage easement agreement, Caldwell's survey rights agreement, Frances's water allocation agreement, and Mara went through each one with the deliberate focus she had brought to Colter's original document, asking questions, making notes, finding the structural similarities. They were there. Not identical language, Victor had been careful enough to vary the specific wording, but the same architecture, the same buried clause, differently labeled, the same pricing mechanism that violated territorial statute, the same notary, Fletcher Gaines, certifying in each case that the signatory had understood what they were signing. Frances Hobart, watching Mara work through the documents, said after a while, "Where did you come from?" Mara looked up. "Pennsylvania," she said. "That's not what I mean." Frances looked at her directly, without any of the performance that the question might have carried from someone else. It was just a genuine inquiry from a woman who was used to evaluating situations plainly. "What did you do before?" Mara held her gaze for a moment. The kitchen was quiet enough that the lamp was audible. "I worked with estates," she said. "Properties that had run into trouble. Financial restructuring, asset recovery, legal challenges." She paused. "I did it for 8 years in 4 different states." The room had the quality of people adjusting to a new weight of information. "Why did you stop?" Frances said. "I didn't stop," Mara said. "I'm doing it now." She looked back at the documents. "The difference is that this time it's mine too." Abbott sent his full analysis on the 3rd day, a 10-page document that was the most detailed thing Mara had seen from him. He had found what he was looking for. The coordination between the bank's acceleration decision and Blackwell Land Management's documented communications could be established through the timing of correspondence that was, in theory, Public record. Craddock had sent an internal memo. Abbott had sources he didn't name that referenced Blackwell's right of purchase agreement as a relevant consideration in the acceleration decision, which meant the bank had not made an independent commercial decision. It had made a decision in coordination with a party who had a direct financial interest in the outcome. "This is enough," Mara said, looking at the analysis. "Enough for what?" Colter said. "Enough to go above county level?" She looked at him. "The letters I sent, 2 of them went to men I worked with in Pennsylvania. One is now with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. The other is a journalist in Cheyenne who covers land fraud and has been looking for a story with enough documentation to hold up." She paused. "They'll need everything Abbott has. They'll need the agreements, the analysis, the bank memo." She met his eyes. "This stops being something Victor can manage locally when it becomes something that exists on paper at the territorial level and in a newspaper story." Colter was quiet for a long moment. "When you said you walked away from wealth and recognition to come here," he said carefully, did you choose this arrangement?" It was the question he hadn't asked in the back of the feed store on the first day, and she had known it was there. Mara folded Abbott's analysis along its crease. "I chose to come west," she said. "The auction was not what I had expected." She looked at the window. "I had intended to find work, legitimate work, with a household that needed what I could do. The agency that arranged my travel gave me limited information about the arrangement." She paused. "But I don't make decisions by looking backward. I was here, and this was the situation, and I decided what to do with it." Colter thought about what that meant, the compressed practical logic of it, the absence of self-pity. He thought about what it would have felt like to arrive somewhere and find it was not what you had been told, and to make your decision and keep going anyway. I'm glad you decided what you did," he said. She looked at him. There was a moment, the kind that happened now and then between them, a moment where the ordinary surface of the thing gave way slightly to what was underneath it, not dramatically, not with any resolution, but with the honesty of 2 people who were figuring out something real at the same time as everything else. "So am I," she said. "Most of the time." The water surveyor came on Friday and spent a full day on the east section. His name was Hendricks, and he was a lean, precise man who spoke mainly in technical terms and had a way of discussing findings that made them sound like established facts even while he was still determining them. By late afternoon, he had enough to produce a preliminary assessment, which he shared with Colter and Mara standing at the dig site while the light went flat and thin above them. The source was a genuine artesian spring, he said. Subsurface movement consistent with a confined aquifer, significant pressure, likely volume of flow that he estimated in numbers that made Colter close his eyes for a moment. The catchment potential was, with appropriate infrastructure, sufficient to support expanded cattle operations and crop irrigation across the full east section and potentially portions of the central section. He said all of this in the professional tone of a man delivering technical data. What he was actually saying was that the land Victor Blackwell had been trying to acquire through fraudulent contract language was worth, conservatively, 4 times what Victor's assessor would have priced it at under the clause. Hendricks packed up his equipment and went. Pete stood at the edge of the dig site and looked down into the shaft where the moisture was still visible at the bottom, steady and patient. He had the expression of someone who didn't quite know what to do with what he was feeling, which Colter recognized because he felt approximately the same way. Mara wrote in her notebook and then looked at the east section in the fading light. "We need to protect this," she said. "Legally, immediately. The survey documentation needs to be filed as part of the asset record before Victor has any opportunity to create a competing claim." "Abbott can do that?" "Abbott can start it. The territorial contact can help move it." She closed her notebook. "And Colter?" She stopped. "What?" She looked at him with a directness that was different from her usual directness. Something more personal in it, something less managed. "Victor is going to come at this hard when he understands what the survey shows. Not through Cliff anymore. Not through the bank, through a letter. Directly." She paused. "He's going to try to make this about me. About who I am and where I came from, and whether you can trust what I've been doing." She held his gaze. "He's going to tell you things about my past that he's had someone find out, and some of it will be accurate and some of it will be shaped." Colter looked at her. "Is there something I should know?" Yes, she said, but I want to tell you myself. Not as a defense, just so you know. She looked at the survey site and then back at him. Come inside. I'll make coffee. They sat at the kitchen table as the dark came down outside, and Mara told him. She told him about the work she had done in Pennsylvania for 7 years beginning when she was 22. The estate consulting, the debt restructuring, the legal navigating of fraudulent land agreements, not unlike the ones they were dealing with now. She had been hired by a firm run by a man named Gerald Aldrich, and she had been good at what she did in the way that some people are good at a thing, so naturally that it becomes the center of their identity before they realize they have let it. She told him about the Harmon estate, a large case, the largest she had handled, a property in the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania, where a family had been systematically defrauded by a set of business partners over the course of a decade. She had spent 18 months unraveling it, and when she was done, the family had recovered a significant portion of what they had lost, and 2 of the partners were facing serious legal consequences. She told him that one of those partners had been a man with connections, and that the connections had reached into the firm she worked for, and that when the case was concluded, Gerald Aldrich had told her that her continued employment was creating problems for the firm's other relationships, and that it would be better for everyone if she made other arrangements. She had been paid out, given a reference that was technically positive and substantively useless, and told that her talent for finding things people had hidden was not a quality that fit comfortably in a world where the people hiding things and the people exposed to the hiding things often did business with each other. She had spent a year deciding what to do with that. She had money saved and she had skills, and she had a clear-eyed assessment of what she was and what she wasn't and what she wanted. She had come west because the West was where the problems were newer, and the power hadn't had time to completely cement itself, and she had thought there might be room to do work that mattered without the full weight of the established machinery working against her. She did not tell it as a tragedy. She told it the way she told most things, plainly, with the editorializing limited to what was necessary for accuracy. When she finished, Colter was quiet for a moment. He had been quiet through most of it, listening in the complete way he had when he was taking something in rather than preparing a response. The man with the connections, he said. Did Victor find out about him? Victor doesn't need to find out about him specifically, she said. He just needs to find out that I was dismissed from a firm and that the circumstances were complicated. He can shape what that looks like without needing to know the full story. But I know the full story, Colter said. She looked at him. You told me, he said. That's the full story. He looked at his coffee cup and then at her. What Victor knows or doesn't know about your past doesn't change what I've watched you do for the last 2 weeks in front of my eyes. Mara looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than her usual ones, not because it was more concealed, but because it was less managed, more exposed to its own complexity. It was the look of someone who had been self-sufficient for long enough that the offer of being believed required a moment to adjust to. You're a more complicated man than you present yourself as, she said finally. I've been told that before, he said. Usually not as a compliment. She almost smiled. He had seen that almost smile a few times now. The way it moved through her expression and then passed, like something she had decided not to fully commit to yet, but hadn't entirely dismissed. It's a compliment, she said. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did on clear nights, working at the corners of the house, and the lamp made small movements that sent the shadows around the kitchen in slow rotations. Somewhere in the east section, 11 feet down in hard clay and older soil, water was finding its way upward through the dark, patient and steady, doing what it had been doing for a very long time before anyone thought to look for it. Tomorrow, Victor Blackwell would learn what the survey had found. Tomorrow, the shape of the fight would change. But tonight the kitchen was warm and the coffee was still hot. And for the first time since Mara Whitmore had arrived at the Fallen Creek Ranch, neither of them felt entirely alone in what was coming. Victor Blackwell learned about the water survey on a Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon the quality of his response had made it clear that the preliminary version of his concern, the careful visit, the measured offer, the pressure through the bank, had given way to something with less patience in it. The first sign was Fletcher Gaines. Gaines came to the Fallen Creek property unannounced, which was something he had never done in 4 years of being Colter's lawyer. I was a small man who had always dressed carefully, as if precise tailoring could offset something imprecise in his character. and he arrived in a buggy that was nicer than anything the work required and stood at the door with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and is already not sure it's enough. Colter answered the door and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "I'd like to talk," Gaines said. "I imagine you would," Colter said. He stepped back and let him in, not because he felt hospitable, but because he wanted to hear what the man had come to say, and the porch was not the right place for it. Mara was in the study. She came to the kitchen doorway when she heard the door and looked at Gaines with the particular focused attention she brought to things she had been thinking about and was now seeing directly for the first time. Gaines looked at her and then at Colter and then back at her with the expression of a man recalculating. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Mr. Gaines," she said. She did not move from the doorway. Gaines sat down at the kitchen table with the air of a man who needed to sit down. He put his hat on the table and then picked it up again and held it. "I want you to know," he said, directing it at Colter, "that when I reviewed the Blackwell agreement for you 2 years ago, I believed I was acting in your interest." "Did you?" Colter said. Yes." Gaines's voice had a quality that Mara recognized, the specific texture of a partial truth, something that was accurate in the letter and dishonest in the spirit. "Victor presented the mediation arrangement as standard. He told me the language was boilerplate." "And you didn't read it carefully enough to know otherwise," Colter said. Gaines opened his mouth and then closed it. "The language was sophisticated," he said finally. I should have caught Section 14. He stopped. "I'm telling you this because I want the opportunity to correct it. I've prepared a statement, voluntary, uncoerced, documenting what I understood the agreement to contain and what it actually contained. The difference." He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope and set it on the table. "Abbott can use it, in whatever proceedings he files." The kitchen was quiet. Mara looked at the envelope and then at Gaines. "Why now?" she said. Gaines looked at her. "Because Abbott has been asking questions, and the questions he's asking are the right ones. And because a man named Harrington in the Territorial Land Commissioner's office has apparently made an inquiry to the county clerk about a series of land agreements in this county, and because—" He stopped. He looked at his hat. "Because I've done a great deal of business with Victor Blackwell over 20 years, and I've told myself most of it was simply how things worked, and I've reached the point where that explanation doesn't hold anymore." It was not a confession of heroism. It was the statement of a man who had done wrong things with the cover of small justifications until the cover was no longer sufficient. Mara looked at it plainly for what it was. "The statement needs to be specific," she said, "not general. Specific dates, specific language, specific conversations you had with Blackwell about what the clause was meant to accomplish." Gaines looked at her steadily. "It is," he said. She picked up the envelope. She did not open it in front of him. She would read it in full before deciding anything. But she held it with the weight of something that had value and said, "We'll be in touch." Gaines stood, picked up his hat, and left with the manner of a man who has put down something heavy and doesn't know yet whether he's better or worse for it. After the buggy had gone, Pete appeared from the direction of the barn with the expression he wore when he'd been within earshot of something and was deciding whether to pretend he hadn't been. "Was that Gaines?" he said. "Yes," Colter said. Pete thought about this. "Huh," he said, which was Pete's way of indicating that he had absorbed significant information and would be processing it privately. Mara read the statement that evening twice and found it more useful than she had allowed herself to expect. Gaines had been specific in the way she'd demanded, documenting 3 conversations with Blackwell, in which the purpose of the clause had been discussed in terms that were unambiguous. Blackwell had told Gaines, in the second conversation, that the east section of the Hayes property was the target, and that the pricing mechanism needed to ensure he could acquire it below market value when Hayes inevitably defaulted. Gaines had written those words down from memory and signed the statement. She wrote to Abbott that night and enclosed a copy of the statement with a note that said simply, "This changes the timeline. How quickly can you file?" Abbott's response came the following Tuesday. "I can file Thursday, but I need the 8 agreements in hand with signed declarations from each rancher by Wednesday morning. Can you manage that?" She could manage that, but it required 2 days of work that left very little time for anything else. She rode to Harlan Briggs's property on Monday, and to Francis Hobart's on Monday afternoon, and to Caldwell's on Tuesday morning, and she sat with each of them and went through the declaration process with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the quality of the documentation was exactly as important as the documentation itself. Francis Hobart had questions about the territorial process that Mara answered in full. Caldwell had concerns about what it would mean for his relationships in the county if the case became public. Mara told him honestly that it would become public, that he should expect that, and that the alternative was allowing the situation to continue. Caldwell signed. The other ranchers Harlan had contacted, two brothers named Gish, who ran a cattle and grain operation, a man named Porter, who had lost a significant portion of his land to a separate Blackwell arrangement 2 years earlier, were more complicated. Porter was willing but frightened in a specific way, the fear of a man who had already lost once and was not sure he could afford to lose again. Mara sat with him for an hour in his kitchen, which was smaller and less comfortable than the Fallen Creek kitchen, and she talked him through the legal protections Abbott was putting in place and what the declaration would and would not commit him to. She did not tell him there was no risk. She told him the risk of not acting was the same risk he'd already been living with, just slower. He signed on Tuesday afternoon. All 8 declarations and copies of all 8 agreements were in Abbott's hands by Wednesday morning. Victor Blackwell made his public move on Wednesday evening. He held what he called a community meeting in the main hall of the Red Hollow Town Council building, a room that held about 100 people, and on that evening held somewhere near 80, which represented a significant portion of the adult population of the area. He had not advertised it as being about any specific matter, only that there were important community concerns he wanted to address, and the combination of Victor's authority and the accumulated rumors of the past several weeks had produced a turnout that suggested the town was ready for something to happen and didn't much care which direction it went. Colter had known about the meeting. Roy Pettis had mentioned it at the fence line the day before, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information without endorsing the source. Colter had told Mara, and they had discussed whether to attend for approximately 4 minutes before Mara said that not attending would be interpreted as weakness and that they should go. They arrived together, which was the right decision for reasons Mara had thought through and Colter had understood, without needing them, explained. They sat in the middle of the room, not at the back where they would look defensive, and not at the front where they would look confrontational, and Colter nodded to people he knew, and Mara sat beside him with her hands in her lap, and her expression composed. Victor stood at the front of the room with the ease of a man who had stood in front of rooms his entire life and had never once found it uncomfortable. He was dressed well, as always, and he had brought with him a man Colter didn't recognize, tall, in a city suit, with the manner of someone imported specifically for this occasion. Victor thanked everyone for coming. He expressed his usual commitment to the community, which was lengthy and specific, and mentioned several things he had funded or built or supported over the years, allowing the list to do its work without seeming to list it. Then he said that he had become aware of certain activities in the county. He didn't name names, which was a choice, because not naming names meant everyone in the room could look at whoever they thought he meant, that had the potential to create significant disruption to the land arrangements that underpin the stability of the community. He said the word stability several times. The man in the city suit, whose name Victor gave as Davenport and whose title was described as a land and property consultant, then spoke for about 15 minutes about the legal complexity of territorial land agreements and the importance of ensuring that challenges to existing arrangements were carefully considered before any action was taken, because disruption to established agreements could have, he used the word cascading, effects on property values and lending relationships throughout the county. It was well done. Mara watched it with the attention of someone studying a technique. Victor had not said anything false, technically. He had not named anyone. He had not made a specific accusation. He had assembled a room full of people who depended on stable land values and told them, in professional language, that something was threatening stability. The threat was not named. It didn't need to be. When Davenport finished, Victor opened the floor to questions, which was a further confidence. A man who controlled a room could afford to open it to questions because he had already controlled the terms of what the questions could be about. A man near the back. Colter recognized him as one of the smaller farmers, a man named Hess, who had always voted with whoever seemed to be winning, asked about what specifically was being challenged. Victor said the specifics were still being determined, but that the important thing was that the community have the information it needed to understand the potential implications. This was the moment Mara stood up. She did it without announcement, without asking permission, the way you stand up when you have something to say and have decided to say it. The room noticed immediately, not just because she stood, but because of who she was, and because the room had been arranged around an unstated subject, and the unstated subject had just made itself present. Victor looked at her with the particular quality of attention he had given her at the auction, the assessing patience of a man deciding how to categorize something. He didn't tell her to sit down. That would have been the wrong move, and he was too experienced to make the wrong move. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, with the courtesy of a man who had been waiting for this. "I'd like to ask Davenport a question," Mara said. Her voice carried without effort. "Specifically about Section 14, subsection C of the Blackwell Land Management Mediation Agreement, which contains a right of purchase clause with a pricing mechanism that violates territorial statute on neutral assessment requirements." The room went quiet, and the way rooms go quiet when something specific enters a conversation that has been general. Davenport looked at Victor. Victor's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A small adjustment, the mechanism recalibrating. "This isn't the venue," Davenport began. "You've been speaking to the community about land agreements for 15 minutes, Mara said. "I'm asking about a specific land agreement. If this isn't the venue for specifics, then I'm not sure what the venue has been for." There was a sound in the room, not quite laughter, not quite approval, but something between those things, the involuntary response of people who recognize when a point has been made. Victor said calmly, "I think what Mrs. Hayes is referring to is a private legal matter that's been mischaracterized by people who have an interest in mischaracterizing it." He looked around the room with the ease of a man managing his audience. "The agreement she's describing was a legitimate mediation arrangement that resolved a boundary dispute. The idea that it contains anything improper is—" He paused, just long enough. "Well, it's the kind of claim that gets made by people who are looking for ways to avoid the consequences of their own financial decisions." The room absorbed this. Colter, sitting, felt the particular physical sensation of hearing someone say something about you in public that is designed to be unanswerable without sounding defensive. He kept his face still. Mara said, "Fletcher Gaines has provided a signed statement documenting conversations with Mr. Blackwell, in which the purpose of that clause was discussed explicitly. The statement is currently in the hands of the Territorial Land Commissioner's office." She paused. "Is there similar agreements between Blackwell Land Management and 7 other property owners in this county, each containing the same structural clause and the same pricing mechanism?" This was new information for most of the room. Colter watched people's faces, the shifts, the glances at neighbors, the quiet arithmetic of people realizing that the thing they had been told was a private dispute was something larger. Harlan Briggs, who was sitting 3 rows back and had not said anything since arriving, said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to being heard outdoors, "My agreement is one of them." Francis Hobart, from the left side of the room, said, "Mine as well." The room had a different quality now. Victor was still standing at the front of it, still composed, still in control of his own expression, but the room itself had shifted under him in a way that composure alone could not fully address. He said, looking at Mara, "I understand you have some background in this area. Property disputes, estate work. I hear you were quite capable before your employer in Pennsylvania found it necessary to let you go." It landed the way he intended it to land. A stone dropped into water, the ripples moving outward through the room, people who hadn't known doing the math, people who had suspected finding their suspicion confirmed. It was a well-chosen weapon, not a direct accusation of anything specific, just the suggestion of something that would make a room of people who didn't know Mara decide they should be uncertain about her. Colter stood up. He had not planned to stand up. I was not a man who was comfortable with public speaking in the way Victor was comfortable with it, and he knew his own limitations in a room. He was not smooth. He did not have the management of an audience. He was better at one thing, said clearly, than at the sustained orchestration of a room's feeling. But he stood up, and the room turned. Mara's employer in Pennsylvania, Colter said, dismissed her after she successfully recovered a family's estate from partners who had been defrauding them for 10 years. The reason she was dismissed was that the partners had business relationships with the firm. That's the full story. He looked at Victor. "You had someone find part of it. I know the whole thing." Victor looked at him with the assessing patience. "You've known her less than a month, Hayes." "I know what I've watched her do," Colter said, which is more than most people in this room can say, because they haven't been watching. He sat down. His heart was going at a pace that he was aware of and trying not to show, because he was not naturally a person who stood up in rooms and said things, and the physical response of his body to doing it was considerable and not particularly dignified. Mara looked at him from beside him without turning her head, just a small sideways attention. He didn't look back, but he was aware of it. Victor made a decision that was visible to Mara in the way he assembled his next expression. The decision to absorb this and move past it rather than push on it, which was the right decision, and also the admission that pushing on it further would cost him more than he'd gain. "I think we've covered the ground we set out to cover," Victor said to the room, with the manner of a man concluding something he is in charge of. "I appreciate everyone coming. We'll have more information for the community as this develops." It was a graceful exit from a position that had become less comfortable than he'd planned, and he managed it well, but the room did not leave with the feeling Victor had brought it there to have, and everyone present, including Victor, knew it. Outside afterward, in the street, Harlan Briggs came to stand beside Colter with his big hands in his coat pockets and said, "That was something." "I'm not sure what it was," Colter said honestly. "It was something," Harlan said again, with a certainty that didn't require elaboration. Francis Hobart found Mara on the steps and said, without preamble, "The Pennsylvania thing. Does it matter?" "To what?" Mara said. "To Abbott's case." "No," Mara said. "Abbott's case is built on documents, not on who I am." Francis looked at her with the appraising directness that was her primary mode of engagement. "Good," she said, "because the rest of it doesn't matter either. Not to me." She went down the steps and walked toward her buggy without adding anything to that, because Francis Hobart was not a woman who felt the need to elaborate when she had said the thing she meant. Roy Pettis materialized out of the departing crowd with the slightly apologetic quality he often had, as if his own presence required a small measure of excuse. "Victor's going to move quickly now," he said to Colter, low. "He doesn't like being put in a position like that, especially not in front of people." He paused. "You watch the bank, and you watch the county clerk's office. He's got levers in both." "Abbott files Thursday," Colter said. Roy nodded once, slowly, and drifted back into the dispersing crowd. The filing happened Thursday as Abbott had promised, and the precision of its timing was something Mara had worked on with care. The complaint named Victor Blackwell and Blackwell Land Management in a coordinated land fraud scheme involving 9 properties, substantiated by 8 agreements, a signed statement from the notarizing attorney, documentary evidence of banking coordination, and a surveyor's report establishing that the primary target property contained a subsurface water source that had been specifically concealed from the right of purchase pricing assessment. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office had been formally notified 3 days prior, and a man named Harrington, the contact Mara had reached through her former colleague, had sent a response that Abbott described, in his careful, understated way, as indicating serious interest. The complaint was also filed the same day with the county court, because Abbott wanted it on record locally, even if the significant action was going to happen at the territorial level. Victor's response to the filing came through a lawyer named Mercer from Cheyenne, a larger, more expensive, more formidable operation than Abbott, which was expected and which Abbott had prepared for. Mercer filed a counter-motion challenging the standing of the complainants and the validity of Gaines's statement on the grounds that it had been provided under duress, which was not true, but was a thing that could be argued until a judge decided it wasn't. This was the part that took time. Mara had known it would take time, and she had told Colter it would take time, and knowing it and living it were not quite the same thing. The ranch operated. The East Section water infrastructure, a pump, a primary distribution pipe, the beginning of an irrigation system that Pete had taken on with an investment of effort that suggested he had decided the place was worth it, moved forward at the pace that available labor and money allowed. The cattle were in better condition than they had been the previous year. The feed supplier arrangement Mara had negotiated in Millhaven continued to hold. The bank acceleration demand remained in effect, and this was the thing that pressed most immediately because it had the 30-day clock on it, and 23 of those days were gone. Abbott had filed for an injunction preventing the bank from finalizing the acceleration while the fraud case was under active review, on the grounds that the acceleration had been coordinated with the fraudulent agreement and was therefore itself potentially part of the scheme. The injunction request was pending before the county judge. The county judge was a man named Delacroix, who had been on the bench for 11 years and who had, over those 11 years, developed a relationship with Victor Blackwell that fell somewhere between professional and social and had never been required to define itself more specifically than that. Mara had flagged this to Abbott, and Abbott had flagged it in the injunction filing and requested that the matter be heard by a visiting judge on the grounds of potential conflict of interest. This request was itself pending. In the meantime, the 30-day clock continued. On day 26, Delacroix denied the conflict of interest request and scheduled a hearing on the injunction for day 31, one day after the bank acceleration would technically be final. Mara read the scheduling notice at the kitchen table and said nothing for about 30 seconds. "He's giving Victor the window," Colter said. "He's giving Victor the window," Mara confirmed. Her voice was even, but her hand on the table had made a fist, which was the clearest indication of what she was feeling that she was likely to give. If the acceleration finalizes before the injunction is heard, Blackwell can immediately invoke the clause. By the time the hearing happens, the right of purchase action will already be in motion. Colter looked at the notice. "What do we do?" Mara unclenched her hand. "I write to Harrington tonight," she said. "If the territorial office issues a hold on any land transactions related to the properties named in the fraud complaint, which is within their authority, it supersedes what Delacroix does or doesn't do at the county level." She looked at Colter. "It's a bigger ask. It requires Harrington to move faster than he was planning to. Can you get him to do it?" "I don't know," she said. It was one of the few times she had said those words. "But I know what I'm going to say." She wrote the letter that night, 4 pages, handwritten, laying out the Delacroix scheduling decision, the timing coordination with the bank acceleration, and the direct connection to the fraud complaint documentation. She was specific about the dates, specific about the statute that gave the territorial office the authority she was invoking, specific about what the consequences of delay would be for 9 property owners whose cases were actively pending. She did not overstate. She did not make emotional appeals. She made the case on its merits, clearly and completely, and asked for the specific action she needed. She sealed it and gave it to Pete before dawn. Day 28 brought Victor to the Fallen Creek property again. This time, he didn't stop at the gate. He rode up the main road and to the house itself and dismounted without invitation, which was a statement. Colter came out onto the porch, and they faced each other across the yard in the morning light, and the quality of the air between them was different from the previous visit. Less performance in it, less of the managed patience. Something had thinned. "I want to talk to your wife," Victor said. "She's available," Colter said. "You can talk to both of us." Victor looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Inside, Mara was at the study desk when they came in, and she rose and came to the kitchen with the composure of a woman who had been expecting this visit, even if she hadn't known the specific day. She stood at the kitchen counter and did not sit, which was a choice. Standing gave her the option to be equal in height with the men in the room, rather than looking up from a chair. Victor sat at the table without being invited to, which was also a statement. He put his hat on the table and looked at Mara directly. "I want to offer you something," he said. "You've made several offers," Mara said. "This one is different." He looked from her to Colter and back. "I will withdraw the right of purchase claim entirely. I'll release the clause. The bank acceleration, I'll recommend to Craddock that it be rescinded and the original terms reinstated." He paused. "All of it, in exchange for the withdrawal of the fraud complaint." The kitchen was quiet. "And the other 8 ranchers?" Mara said. "Their agreements would be voided as well," Victor said. "Formally, I would release all 9 claims." He paused again. "It costs me something significant. I'm offering it because a territorial investigation will cost everyone in this county something significant. Business relationships, lending arrangements, things that matter to people who have nothing to do with the legal situation." He looked at Mara steadily. "You understand community dynamics. You know that collateral damage is real." It was not a bad argument. It was, in its way, a sophisticated one. An offer that had genuine value on its face and that came wrapped in a concern for others that was partially real and partially instrumental, and the combination was harder to dismiss cleanly than pure self-interest would have been. Mara looked at him for a moment. "Does your offer include a formal written acknowledgement of what the clause was designed to do?" Victor's expression shifted by a fraction. It includes a release of all claims. The past specifics, if you withdraw the fraud complaint without any acknowledgement of the conduct, then the same approach can be used again, Mara said. Different county, different properties, different names, or the same county in 5 years with different targets. She looked at him without hostility, just the clear statement of a thing. A release is not a resolution. Victor looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not the managed expression he usually deployed, but something closer to what he actually thought, which was rare enough that Colter noticed it. "You're not going to settle," Victor said. "I'm going to settle when the settlement means something," Mara said. "Not before." Victor picked up his hat and stood. He looked at Colter. "You married a woman who would rather win than solve the problem," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It had the quality of something he was saying because he needed to say something. "I married a woman who knows the difference between those two things," Colter said. Victor left. The yard was quiet after the sound of his horse died away down the road. Pete appeared from the barn with a water bucket in each hand and the expression of a man who had been doing work that happened to afford him an excellent view of the yard and was now returning to his business. Colter looked at Mara. "Was that the right call?" "Yes," she said. Then, after a moment, "I think yes." She looked at the table. "Ask me again in a week." Harrington's response arrived on day 30. It was not a letter. It was a formal notice on Territorial Land Commissioner letterhead, and it was addressed to the county clerk of Red Hollow County and to Judge Delacroix, with copies to Abbott and to all 9 complainants. It declared a provisional hold on all land transactions related to properties named in the pending fraud complaint, effective immediately, pending review by the Territorial Office. The hold was authorized under a territorial statute that Mara had cited in her letter and that predated the county's authority in matters of coordinated land fraud involving multiple properties. The hold meant that Victor Blackwell could not exercise the right of purchase clause. It meant the bank acceleration, even if it finalized, could not trigger the land transaction. It meant that whatever Delacroix did or didn't do in his court on day 31 was operating under the territorial hold, which he could not override. Mara read the notice twice, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and then she set it down on the table and sat down and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Colter was watching her. He had seen her controlled and purposeful and careful, and occasionally something that he recognized as anger held at a careful distance. He had not seen whatever this was, the specific quality of sitting down and putting your hands on a table, because the thing you have been working toward has happened, and the body needs a moment. "It worked," he said. "It worked for now," she said. Her voice was steady but had something different in its texture. "This is a hold, not a judgment. The territorial review will take months. Victor has resources and Mercer is a good lawyer and there will be more moves." She looked up. "But the clock has stopped. We have time." "Because of what you did," Colter said. She looked at him. "Because of what we did," she said. "You stood up in that room. You sent a rider to Graysville at 4 in the morning. You trusted me with things I asked you to trust me with." She paused. "It doesn't work without all of it." He looked at the notice on the table. He thought about his father saying there was water under the east section and people telling him he was wrong. He thought about the morning at the auction when he had said, "I'll take her," without fully knowing why, and the way she had looked at him from the platform with the focused calm of someone deciding whether to update a calculation. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I said I'd take her, he said, correcting himself. "I didn't know what I was doing. I want to be straight with you about that. I knew why I did it, but I didn't know what I was doing." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "And now I do know," he said. "What I'm doing." He paused. "What we're doing. I want you to know that I know." It was not the most eloquent declaration anyone had ever made across a kitchen table. He was aware of that. He was not a man who said things easily, and he had pushed his capacity for it already at the meeting, and what remained was not poetry. But it was true, which was the thing he had to offer. Mara looked at him for a moment. The almost smile moved through her expression, and this time it didn't pass. It stayed, not wide, not performed, just genuinely there. The expression of a woman who has built careful walls against exactly this kind of thing, and has found, with some surprise, that one of them is no longer standing. "Then we're the same," she said. Because I know too. Outside, Pete was doing something with the east section pump that involved a considerable amount of noise and at least one exclamation that was probably profane, and the cattle were moving in their new pattern across the land, and the spring was doing what it had always done, moving through the dark soil, patient and steady, finding its way to the surface with the particular persistence of things that have been there all along, waiting for someone to look in the right place. The territorial notice sat on the table between them, and the morning was warm enough that the window was open, and for the first time in as long as Colter could remember, the sound of the ranch outside felt like something that belonged to him rather than something he was fighting to keep. The months that followed the territorial hold were the hardest kind of hard. Not the sharp, immediate hard of a crisis, but the grinding hard of a thing that isn't over and won't tell you when it will be. Mara had warned Colter about this. She had said, the morning after Harrington's notice arrived, that the hold was a pause and not a verdict, and that Victor Blackwell was not the kind of man who accepted a pause as a final answer. She had been right about that the way she was right about most things. Not with satisfaction, not looking for acknowledgement, just accurately. Mercer, Victor's Cheyenne lawyer, filed 3 separate motions in the first 6 weeks after the territorial hold. The first challenged the commissioner's authority to issue the hold without a formal hearing. The second sought to have Gaines's statement excluded from evidence on the grounds that it had been prepared in anticipation of litigation and was therefore self-serving. The third attempted to reframe the entire fraud complaint as a commercial dispute between private parties that should be handled at the county level, meaning before Delacroix, meaning in territory where Victor had spent 20 years cultivating the ground. Abbott responded to all 3, and the responding took time, and the time cost money that Colter didn't have in surplus. Mara had restructured the ranch's cash flow carefully enough that they could service the reinstated bank debt. Craddock had backed down from the acceleration after the territorial hold made the coordination risk visible and uncomfortable, which was the only language Craddock spoke with any fluency. But there was not much room. Margin, Mara called it. They did not have enough of it. The east section water infrastructure moved forward on the schedule Pete had set for himself, which was optimistic in the way that Pete had turned out to be optimistic once he had decided something was worth doing. By the 8th week after the hold, there was a functioning pump and primary distribution line and the beginning of an irrigation system that reached 2/3 of the east section. The cattle were heavier than they had been in 3 years. The grass in the central fields, supplemented now by water from the east, was coming back in a way that Colter stood in front of some mornings just looking at because the color of it was something he hadn't seen since before the drought, and it did something to him that he couldn't fully explain. He tried to explain it to Mara one morning while they were walking the fence line. She listened, which was one of the things about her that still caught him sometimes. The completeness of her attention, the way she didn't use the time when someone was talking to prepare what she was going to say next. She just listened. "It sounds like relief," she said when he finished. "It feels bigger than that," he said. She looked at the grass. "Maybe it's both things at once," she said. "Relief and something else that doesn't have a word." He thought about that for a while. She was probably right. She usually was. Well, the territorial review hearing was scheduled for November, which was 4 months after the hold had been issued. And in the intervening time, something happened to Red Hollow that Mara had predicted in outline, but that turned out to be more significant in specifics than she had anticipated. The story broke in a Cheyenne newspaper in late September. She had known it was coming. She had given the journalist, a man named Calloway, everything Abbott had in documented form, and Calloway had spent 6 weeks verifying it independently, which was what a careful journalist did, and which was why Mara had chosen him specifically. But knowing a thing is coming and experiencing the actual morning when Pete rides in from town with a newspaper and puts it on the kitchen table with the expression of a man who is not sure how to feel about what he's carrying, those are different experiences. The story was on the front page, which was not something Mara had been able to guarantee and had not promised herself. Calloway had written it the way she had hoped he would write it. Specific, documented, the kind of journalism that names names and cites sources and doesn't leave the reader room to dismiss it as rumor. He had the aid agreements, the Gaines statement, the banking correspondence, the surveyor's report, the territorial hold notice. He had testimony from 3 of the 9 ranchers, including Harlan Briggs, who had apparently decided that the time for quiet was past. The headline was straightforward and devastating in its specificity. Land scheme targets 9 properties in Red Hollow County. Territorial Commission opens formal review. Colter read it at the kitchen table. Mara sat across from him and drank her coffee and watched his face while he read. He used everything, Colter said. He's a good journalist, Mara said. That's what good journalists do. Victor is going to react badly, she said. Yes. But there's a difference between reacting badly to something contained locally and reacting badly to something that's in print and on its way to every county seat in the territory. She looked at her coffee. The thing about documentation is that it travels. Victor's reach doesn't travel as far as a newspaper does. She was right about that too. But she had underestimated one thing, which she later acknowledged. She had underestimated how quickly the story would reach people who had done business with Victor in other counties, and how many of those people would have their own version of the same story, and how fast those people would start making contact with Calloway once the door was open. By the time the November hearing arrived, Calloway had published 2 additional pieces, each with new ranchers from neighboring counties, each with documented agreements that followed the same structural pattern. The fraud complaint that Abbott had filed on behalf of 9 Red Hollow County properties had become, through the momentum of public reporting and territorial inquiry, a case that involved 31 properties across 3 counties. Victor Blackwell's empire, which had been built over 20 years on the assumption that small-scale fraud distributed across many small parties would never accumulate into something large enough to become visible, had run into the specific problem that all such empires run into when someone begins assembling the pieces into a single picture. Mara drove to Graysville for the November hearing with Colter and with Abbott, who rode with them because he had things to discuss with them that were more easily discussed in a wagon than in letters. He sat in the wagon bed with his briefcase on his knees and talked through what to expect with the careful precision he brought to everything. The Territorial Review Board, he explained, was a 3-person body with the authority to issue binding rulings on land fraud cases that crossed county lines. Mercer had filed a final objection to their jurisdiction, which the board had rejected 2 weeks earlier. The hearing itself was not a trial. It was a review of the documented evidence with the opportunity for both parties to present arguments. A ruling could come the same day or be reserved for up to 30 days. What's the likely outcome? Colter asked. In my opinion, Abbott said with the careful precision of a man who did not make predictions easily, the evidence is sufficient for a ruling in our favor. The pattern across 31 properties is not ambiguous. The gain statement is damaging, and Mercer's motion to exclude it failed. The banking coordination is documented. He paused. The question is remedies, what the board is willing to order. Meaning what specifically? Mara said. Meaning the board can void all fraudulent agreements, which is the minimum we need. They can order restitution to the affected parties, which is significant but requires valuation. They can refer the matter for criminal investigation, which is outside their authority to compel, but within their authority to recommend. He looked at her over his glasses. And they can issue a permanent bar on Blackwell land management operating in the territory. That would be the most significant remedy. Will they go that far? Colter said. I don't know, Abbott said. 31 families is a compelling argument for it. They rode into Graysville through a morning that was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that makes the dry country look honest about itself. And Mara looked at the road ahead with the expression she wore when she was organizing her thinking. Not distant exactly, just interior, processing what was coming. Colter reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers on the seat between them. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she turned her hand over and held his. Neither of them said anything about it. They didn't need to. What? The hearing room was more crowded than Abbott had anticipated. Word had gotten out. Through Calloway's articles, through the territorial notice, through the specific communications network of people who have been wronged by the same person and have been waiting a long time for a room where that wrong can be named. And there were people present from 2 of the neighboring counties, some of them ranchers whose properties were part of the expanded complaint. Some of them people who knew those ranchers. Some of them simply people who had been watching Victor Blackwell operate for years from various positions of proximity and had made the journey to see what happened when the watching produced something. Harlan Briggs was there. Frances Hobart was there, in the same no-nonsense coat she wore to everything that mattered. Roy Pettis had come, which surprised Colter, and had taken a seat near the back where he could see the whole room. The Gish brothers were there. Porter, who had lost land already, and had signed his declaration with the specific courage of a man who has very little left to lose and has decided to spend it, was there with his adult son. Victor Blackwell was there with Mercer and two other men from Mercer's firm. He sat at the table on the respondent's side with the composed manner he always carried, but something about the composition was different now. The slight overwork of it, the way a man's stillness looks different when it is being maintained rather than natural. 20 years of building something and being certain of its foundations, and then watching those foundations be examined in public across multiple counties and multiple hearings, and a series of newspaper articles that used his name precisely and repeatedly, that did something to a man's stillness that was hard to hide from a room full of people who had known him and were looking for it. Mara sat beside Abbott at the complainant's table, and Colter sat behind her, and when the three board members entered and the room came to order, she turned briefly and looked at him. Not for reassurance, not performing composure for his benefit, just looking at him the way she did sometimes, the way that had stopped being surprising to him and had become the thing he oriented to without realizing he was doing it. He nodded once. She turned back. The hearing lasted most of the day. Mercer presented first and at length, and he was as good as Mara had described him. Disciplined, precise, skilled at making things that were clear seem complicated, and things that were documented seem ambiguous. He argued the jurisdictional question one more time, knowing the board had already rejected it, but wanting it on record. He argued that the pricing mechanism in the agreements, while irregular, did not constitute fraud because the signatories had the opportunity to seek independent review. He argued that Gaines's statement was self-serving and potentially coerced. He argued that the banking coordination was circumstantial. He was a good lawyer making a difficult case, and the difficulty showed in the places where his argument had to skip over the things the documentation made unskippable. Abbott presented the complainant's case with the compressed precision he had been building toward for 4 months. He walked the board through the structural pattern of the agreements, through the territorial statute violation in the pricing mechanism, through the Gaines statement and its specificity, through the banking memo, through the surveyor's report on the East Section water value, through the 31 property pattern across 3 counties that made the coincidence argument Mercer had been making structurally impossible. He was not a dramatic lawyer. He was a systematic one, and the system had been built carefully enough that by the time he finished, the shape of what had happened was in the room in a way that all of Mercer's skill was not sufficient to dissolve. The board asked questions for 2 hours. Most of the questions went to Abbott and to the documentation. 3 questions went to Mercer, and one of those 3, a question from the board's senior member, a woman named Alderman, who had gray hair and the patient eyes of someone who had seen a great deal of paper and understood exactly what it meant, was about the Gaines statement and whether Blackwell's firm had any response to the specific conversation Gaines had documented, in which the purpose of the clause had been stated explicitly. Mercer said the conversation as described had not occurred. Alderman looked at him over her reading glasses for a moment. Then she wrote something down and moved on. Victor, who had been watching the proceedings with the composed stillness of his practice, looked at that exchange and looked at Mara, and she was already looking at him. She had been watching him, not constantly, but at intervals, the way you watch something you need to know the current state of. Their eyes met across the room and held for a moment. Not a dramatic moment, not the confrontation of story, just 2 people looking at each other with the full knowledge of what they each knew and what the room was in the process of deciding. Victor looked away first. Mara looked back at Abbott, who had not noticed any of this because he was organizing his papers for the closing summary, which was what Abbott was like, and was one of the reasons she had trusted him. The board reserved its ruling for 30 days. This was expected and was, as Abbott explained on the walk back to where the wagon was waiting, actually a good sign rather than a bad one. A board that ruled the same day generally ruled against the complainant on jurisdictional grounds, whereas a board that reserved was planning to write a substantive ruling, which required the 30 days to do properly. None of that made the 30 days easier to live. The ranch continued. The water continued to come up from the East Section spring with the patient indifference of something that had been there for a very long time before anyone asked it to and would continue after everyone involved was done asking. Pete had extended the irrigation line to the northern section, which was an ambition Mara had mentioned in passing 3 months earlier, and that Pete had apparently stored somewhere and acted on without announcing it, which was very Pete and which made Colter laugh when he found out about it. The cattle were healthy. The feed arrangement with Millhaven held. The bank debt was being serviced on the original schedule, which Craddock had reinstated with the professional impersonality of a man pretending the acceleration had not happened, which was fine with Colter because what he needed from Craddock was not an apology, but a functioning arrangement. The community shifted in the way communities shift when the balance of power in them is visibly in motion. People who had been calibrated to Victor's gravity had organized their social behavior around the assumption that his approval and his displeasure were the significant forces in the room, began, not all at once and not without hesitation, to recalibrate. It was not a clean or comfortable process. Some people who had been unkind to Mara for months found ways to be kind, now that were awkward, in the specific way of people who know they are compensating and can't quite disguise it. Mara accepted these small corrections of behavior without comment, because she had decided that requiring people to perform contrition as the price of basic decency was a waste of energy and produced worse outcomes than simply moving forward. Clara Rudd said good morning to her on the street in October, and Mara said good morning back, and neither of them mentioned the scene at Haggerty's General Store, and the interaction was brief and slightly uncomfortable, and then it was over and life went on. Frances Hobart came by the ranch twice during the 30 days, both times with a specific purpose, and neither time pretending it was a social call, because Frances didn't do that, and both times she sat in the kitchen and talked with Mara about things that were practical, the hearing, the documentation, the territorial review, and once, near the end of the second visit, about something else. "You're going to stay?" Frances said. It was not entirely a question. Mara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Some people thought you wouldn't," Frances said. "Thought once the case was resolved you'd move on to the next thing." She looked at her coffee. "I didn't think that." "Why not?" Mara said. Frances considered it. "Because you rebuilt the cattle operation," she said. "You don't put that kind of work into something you're planning to leave." Mara was quiet for a moment. "That's not the only reason," she said. Frances looked at her with the frank attention she brought to things worth paying attention to. "No," she said. "I don't suppose it is." And she left it there, which was the thing about Frances. She knew when a thing had been said and didn't feel the need to say it again. The board's ruling arrived by territorial post on the 30th day, which was a Thursday in late November. Abbott had sent a copy to the ranch by Ryder, and Mara had his letter in her hands before Colter came in from the morning work. And she was standing at the kitchen counter reading it when he came through the door with cold air on his coat and the expression of a man who has been thinking about this for 30 days and is trying not to show it. He saw her face and stopped. "Tell me," he said. She looked up. Whatever she was feeling was moving through her expression in ways she wasn't managing this time. Not performing composure, not keeping the lid on it, just present with the thing at full size. "They voided all 31 agreements," she said. "Complete fraud finding on all of them. The pricing mechanism violation, the coordinated banking activity, the pattern of deliberate misrepresentation, all of it's in the ruling." She paused. "They ordered restitution for the affected parties at assessed market value as of the date of each agreement. Blackwell Land Management is barred from operating as a land management entity in the territory, permanently." Colter looked at her. "And they referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for criminal investigation," she said. "Abbott says that doesn't guarantee prosecution, but the referral itself is significant." The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. "It's over?" Colter said. "The administrative part is over," Mara said. "The criminal investigation will take as long as it takes. Victor will still have his personal holdings, his local businesses. The ruling doesn't touch those directly. He's going to be diminished but not destroyed, and he's going to spend the next years managing that." She looked at the letter. "But the Fallen Creek East section is ours. The other ranchers' properties are clear, and Blackwell Land Management is finished as a mechanism for doing this to anyone else." Colter sat down at the kitchen table. He sat there for a moment with the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something for so long that when it is lifted, the first thing he feels is not joy, but the strange lightness of the body adjusting to a different weight. "My father," he said. He stopped. "I know," Mara said. "He spent 30 years on this land and died thinking it wasn't worth saving." His voice had the texture of something that had been stored for a long time. And the water was there the whole time. And the land was worth it the whole time. Mara set the letter down and came around the table and sat down across from him. She didn't say anything immediately, and the silence was the kind that doesn't require filling. He wasn't wrong to love it, she said finally. He just didn't have what he needed to save it. Colter looked at his hands on the table. They were his father's hands. He had been told that his whole life, the same width across the palm, the same way the knuckles sat. He thought about what those hands had worked and what they had tried and what they had not been enough for, and he thought about what had been enough and why. He needed someone who knew how to see what was there, he said. Maybe, Mara said, or maybe it was time. Sometimes it's time. The right people at the right moment in the right place. She paused. It doesn't diminish what he built, that it took what it took to keep it. He looked at her. In 4 months, she had become the person he looked at when he needed to understand what something meant, which was not something he had expected to be true of anyone, had not been true of anyone in his life before. And he was still in the process of adjusting to it in the ongoing way you adjust to a thing that doesn't stop being new. I need you to know something, he said. She waited. I'm not a man who says things easily. You know that. I know, she said. So when I say something, you should know it costs me something, not in a bad way, but I don't say things I don't mean. I know that too, she said. She was looking at him with the expression that was entirely herself, not managed, not performed, just present. I'm glad you were at that auction, he said, not because of the ranch, not because of what you knew or what you could do, because of who you are in a room when someone is laughing at you, because of the way you stood there and didn't flinch and looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth updating your calculation for. He paused. I want you to know that whatever comes after this, I chose you before I knew any of the rest of it. Mara was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual pauses. When she spoke, her voice had a quality in it that he had not heard before, something less armored. I've spent a long time, she said, being useful, being the person who could see what was wrong and know how to fix it, and I stopped expecting that to be the reason anyone would. She stopped. She looked at the table. I'm not practiced at this, she said, at being chosen for something other than what I can do. I know, he said. You don't have to be practiced at it. She looked at him. I'm trying to tell you that it matters, she said. What you just said. It matters. I know it does, he said. That's why I said it. The news spread through Red Hollow, the way significant news spreads in small places, not in a controlled way, not through announcements, but through the specific velocity of information that people have been waiting to hear. The territorial ruling was a matter of public record, and Calloway published it in his paper with a follow-up piece that was thorough, and that treated the 31 affected families with the specificity they deserved, naming them and their properties, and what the ruling returned to them. Victor Blackwell did not leave Red Hollow immediately, which Colter had half expected him to do. He was still there, operating his local businesses, sitting on the town council, living in the large house on the east side of town that had always communicated, as it was designed to communicate, the permanence of his position. But the quality of his presence had changed, the way a structure changes when the thing that held it together is removed. Still standing, still there, but different in a way you could feel without being able to point to the specific place where it had changed. People talked to him differently. Not rudely. Most people in Red Hollow were not built for outright rudeness, but with the slight calibration that happens when someone's authority has been formally and publicly found to have been built on something rotten. The deference was gone. The slight leaning toward that people do around power was gone. What remained was just a man, aging, living in a big house, with an empire that had been substantially reduced and a name that had been substantially complicated. Fletcher Gaines surrendered his notary license in December, which Abbott said was the likely outcome given the specificity of the statement Gaines had provided and what it revealed about his own conduct. He also apparently left Red Hollow before the end of the year. Nobody seemed to know exactly where he went, and there was very little discussion of it, which was the town's way of handling things it had collectively decided not to examine too closely. The restitution process took most of the following year. Harlan Briggs received the largest amount, given the scale of his property and the length of time the drainage easement had been in place. Porter, who had already lost land, received an assessment that was significant enough that he could recover a portion of what he'd been forced to sell, which was not everything but was more than he had expected, and which he came to tell Mara about in person, appearing at the Fallen Creek gate. One afternoon in March, with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been trying to figure out what to say for a while. "I just wanted to," he said, and then stopped, and stood there for a moment with the difficulty of a man who is not comfortable with gratitude and is feeling it powerfully. "You stood up when it was hard to stand up," Mara said. "That mattered." "You built the case," he said. "You were part of it," she said. "All of you were." He nodded, still struggling with the whole of it, and eventually just said, "Thank you," and left. And Mara watched him go down the road and stood at the gate for a moment in the spring air before going back inside. The east section bloomed that spring in a way that nobody on the property had seen before. Not bloomed in a flowery sense, but in the specific agricultural sense of land coming into its potential after a long time of being denied the means to do it. The irrigation had extended across the full section by February, Pete having worked through the winter on it with a stubbornness that had become one of his defining qualities. The grass was dense and green. The cattle moved through it with the settled contentment of animals that have found what they need. Colter stood at the edge of the east section on a morning in April and looked at it, and Mara stood beside him. They had developed the habit of walking the property together in the mornings. Not every morning, not when the work demanded otherwise, but often enough that it had become a thing they did rather than a thing they decided each time to do. "Your father would have stood right here," she said. "He would have said he told everyone so," Colter said. "He would have been right." "He would have been insufferable about it," Colter said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, the specific fond exasperation of a son talking about a man who was gone, and the grief in it, and the love in it, and the two things being the same thing. Mara didn't say anything to that. She just stood beside him, which was enough, which was exactly enough. There is something I want to say about what happened in Red Hollow, and about Colter Hayes and Mara Whitmore, and about what it means. Not what it teaches exactly, because I am suspicious of lessons that arrive pre-wrapped and don't require you to sit with them first. What I think about is the auction. 200 people in a square on a dry Saturday morning, and all of them saw the same thing. A woman standing at the edge of the crowd, and a crowd that had decided, in the instantaneous collective way of crowds, what she was worth. And one man who saw something different, not because he was more virtuous than the rest, not because he was specially perceptive or unusually kind. He was a tired man with worn-out boots and a failing ranch, and no particular confidence that anything was going to go right. He saw something different because he was watching a specific thing, the way a person stood in the moment when the world told them they were nothing. And what he saw in that moment was a kind of truth that the noise of the crowd couldn't drown out. We spend a great deal of our lives learning to see what we're told to see. The crowd teaches us what to value and what to dismiss, and the crowd's instruction is constant and loud and begins before we are old enough to question it. And most of us, most of the time, look at the world through that instruction without knowing we're doing it. Colter Hayes stepped outside the instruction for 30 seconds in a town square, and it changed everything. But here's the thing I don't want to simplify. Mara Whitmore was not saved by being chosen. She would have survived without Colter. She had survived without anyone's choosing her for the better part of 31 years, and she had built herself into something formidable in the doing of it, and nothing about her competence or her character or her capacity to endure difficult things required someone else's recognition to be real. The East Section water was there before Colter stood at the edge of the dig site and felt something move through him. It had always been there. What being chosen gave her was something different and smaller and more human than being saved. It gave her a place to belong. Not a place where she was tolerated or useful or accepted on condition. A place that was genuinely hers, where the work she did was for something she cared about and for someone who had chosen her before he knew what she could do. That is a different thing from rescue. That is the difference between being needed and being wanted, and anyone who has experienced both knows they are not the same experience. And Colter, what did he get? He got the ranch, the water, the East Section green with irrigated grass, the cattle healthy, the debt managed, the legal threat resolved. All of that, yes. But the thing I think about is what he said at the kitchen table, the morning the ruling arrived. I chose you before I knew any of the rest of it. He had never said a thing like that to anyone before. He was 41 years old, and he had gone most of his adult life without that specific act of speech, without the experience of saying something that exposed him and finding out that the exposure was not a mistake. That is its own kind of arrival. The discovery that the thing you thought you couldn't afford to risk was actually the thing you couldn't afford not to. Victor Blackwell spent his whole life acquiring. He acquired land and authority and the deference of rooms, and he did it through mechanisms that were designed to be invisible, to look like legitimate transaction while they were actually extraction. He was good at it. He had spent 20 years being good at it. And the thing that undid him was not any single heroic act or any dramatic confrontation. It was documentation. 8 agreements and a statement from a repentant lawyer and a surveyor's report, and the patient work of a woman who had been dismissed from her profession for finding exactly these kinds of things, and who had not let the dismissal define what she did next. The specific cruelty of what Victor did was not the fraud itself. Fraud is old and ordinary. The specific cruelty was that he built his scheme on the assumption that the people he was defrauding would never organize, that they were too isolated, too individually vulnerable, too focused on their own survival to see the pattern across their separate situations. He had bet on the atomization of small people, the way that people who are each struggling alone can't see that they are struggling from the same cause. What Mara did was simple, in the end. She made the invisible pattern visible. She sat in kitchen after kitchen with document after document and said, "Look at this. Look at what it has in common with this." She did not invent the evidence. She assembled it. The evidence had always been there, waiting in each of those agreements. But evidence that is separated into 31 different kitchens in 3 different counties is not the same thing as evidence that is assembled into a coherent picture and placed before a territorial review board. The picture was always there. It just needed someone willing to sit down and put it together. By the following autumn, the autumn that was 2 years after the auction, 2 years after the dry Saturday morning, when a crowd laughed and a man with slapping boots walked forward and said, "I'll take her," the Fallen Creek Ranch had become the kind of operation that the county noted as a reference point. Not famous, not mythologized, just the ranch that had come back from the edge and was operating well, and whose east section was producing in a way that other ranchers asked about, and that Mara was willing to talk through with anyone who asked. She said yes every time someone asked. She said yes to Francis Hobart's neighbor, whose water situation was complicated. She said yes to a young couple who had taken on a failing property on the county's south edge and didn't know where to start. She said yes to Hess, the small farmer who had asked Victor's question at the community meeting, and who came to the ranch one afternoon with his hat in his hands, and a look of genuine embarrassment, and said he needed some advice and wasn't sure he deserved it. "You were in the room," Mara said. "That was all that was. Come in." Hess came in. He sat at the kitchen table. He got his advice. This was not mercy performed for an audience. It was a decision she had made about what kind of person she intended to be, which is the only kind of mercy that actually means anything, the kind that comes from a settled internal place rather than from the desire to be seen being merciful. She had her limits. Some people she did not make easy for. Clara Rudd received civil treatment and nothing warmer, which was its own message and which Clara Rudd, to her credit, seemed to understand. There were 3 members of the town council who had been in Victor's pocket in ways that the territorial ruling had not specifically addressed, and that the community would need to handle over time through its own mechanisms. Mara did not pursue them directly. She trusted the process, and the process, slow and imperfect and frequently frustrating, was in motion. What she gave her energy to was the work, the ranch, the east section, the people who came to the kitchen table with problems she knew how to help with. She wrote to Abbott twice a month and to Harrington once, maintaining the connections that had made the difference and that she understood would be needed again. Not immediately. Not necessarily in the same form. But the kind of people who build what Victor built do not simply cease to exist because one of them has been exposed. The mechanisms recur, the patterns repeat. Documentation matters every time. This was not cynicism. It was the specific clear-eyed realism of someone who has done this work long enough to understand that individual victories are real and important and also incomplete, and that the next thing after a victory is continuing. On a morning in October, 2 years after the auction, Pete came to the kitchen door and said that Roy Pettis was at the fence line with a young man Roy had described as his nephew, who had just taken on a piece of land on the county's north edge and was having a problem with a contract he'd been asked to sign. Mara looked at Colter across the kitchen table. He looked back at her with the expression he had developed in 2 years of watching her, a kind of baseline acknowledgement of what she was, a thing that had started as gratitude and grown into something more durable. "I'll tell them to come in," he said. He went to the door, and she heard him call to Roy across the yard, and she heard Roy's response, and she put more water on for coffee, and the morning continued. This is what it looked like, the life that came after. Not triumphant, not resolved into simplicity, just the ongoing thing, with its texture and its difficulty and its specific compensations. The green of the east section in the morning light, the cattle settled and healthy, the man who had chosen her before he knew what she was capable of coming back through the door and sitting down at the table, and the next person at the gate with the next problem, and the work continuing. The town remembered the day of the auction for a long time. Not as a romantic story, though it had those elements. Not as a legal story, though it had those too. They remembered it as the day something hidden was found. Not just water under dry ground, but the particular truth that the things most worth having are almost never the things that are visible at first glance. Colter Hayes had walked forward in a crowd because he had seen something in a woman's stillness that the noise of the crowd could not explain away. Mara Whitmore had looked down at a tired man with worn boots and calculated whether he was worth updating for. And both of them had been right, in the way that two people can each be right about the same thing from different directions. The east section spring ran on. The water that had been there for decades, patient under the dry ground, found its way up and out into the light and did what water does, made things grow that had not been growing, sustained what needed sustaining, proved that the absence of something visible is not the same as the absence of the thing itself. Some things are simply waiting to be found. The ones who find them are the ones who know how to look,